Look, I've watched The Boys probably 3 times through at this point, and every single time I think I've figured it all out, something new hits me. A piece of trivia, a behind-the-scenes detail, a connection I completely missed. And I know I'm not alone in that because this show has one of the most obsessive fan bases on the entire internet. So today we are going digging. Deep. We are going places the subreddits haven't fully explored, pulling back the curtain on production secrets, character decisions, wild real-world inspirations, and details so small they had to be intentional. By the end of this video, I promise you will see The Boys completely differently. Let's get into it. So let's start with something that will immediately reframe how you think about the entire show. Garth Ennis, the comic book writer who created The Boys back in 2006, has openly admitted that he wrote the original story as a direct response to his frustration with the superhero genre itself. He wasn't a fan. Genuinely not a fan of the direction Marvel and DC were taking things. He thought superheroes had become these sanitized, corporate mascots that companies use to push merchandise and maintain a stranglehold on popular culture. So he created a comic that was essentially the most violent, disgusting, disturbing deconstruction of that world he could possibly imagine. But here's the fascinating part. When Amazon picked it up for television, the showrunner Eric Kripke and his team had to figure out how to adapt material that was, in many places, genuinely unpublishable in terms of mainstream content. And the direction they chose was to make the satire smarter, more pointed, more directly connected to real-world corporate and political power structures. The show became less about gross shock value and more about something that actually made audiences uncomfortable for intellectual reasons. That's a massive creative pivot, and it changed everything about what The Boys became. Now let's talk about Anthony Starr, who plays Homelander, because the performance choices he made for that character are so calculated it borders on scary. Starr has talked in interviews about how he approached Homelander not as a villain but as a deeply traumatized individual who happens to have the power of a god and zero emotional regulation. He spent a lot of time thinking about what it would actually do to a human psyche to never have experienced genuine love or connection as a child, to have been raised in a laboratory environment where you are simultaneously the most powerful being on the planet and completely powerless over your own life. The laser eyes, the flying, the invincibility, none of that is what makes Homelander terrifying. What makes him terrifying is that smile. Starr worked specifically on what he called the mask, this performance of warmth and charm that Homelander deploys publicly, and the way that mask slips when he's alone or when he feels genuinely threatened. If you go back and watch early Season 1 scenes knowing that framework, it completely transforms what you're watching. You start catching these micro-expressions, these tiny moments where the mask flickers. It's genuinely one of the most technically brilliant performances in television history, and it doesn't get talked about enough. Jumping over to Carl Urban, who plays Billy Butcher, and there's a detail here most people don't know. Urban is from New Zealand, and Butcher is written as a British character, specifically from London. Urban has a natural New Zealand accent, which is nothing like a London working-class accent. The preparation he put into that accent was extensive, and Urban has said that the voice, the way Butcher speaks, became the key to unlocking the entire character for him. The accent wasn't just cosmetic. It was psychological. Because when you adopt a completely different voice, a different rhythm of speaking, a different way of landing words, you actually start thinking differently. Urban described it as finding a character from the outside in, which is the opposite of how most actors approach a role. Most people find the internal emotional truth first and let the external details follow. Urban built the shell and discovered who Butcher was by living inside that shell. And honestly, it works. There's never a moment where Butcher feels like Carl Urban playing dress-up. He feels like a completely real, completely separate human being. Here's one that genuinely blew my mind when I first found it. The character of A-Train, who is the seventh speedster and who the show uses to explore themes of racial inequality, celebrity, and exploitation, was actually developed with a very specific real-world parallel in mind. The creators drew heavily from the history of black athletes in American professional sports, particularly from the early to mid-20th century, when black performers and athletes were welcomed into white entertainment spaces as long as they were providing value, and then discarded or diminished the moment their utility expired. A-Train's entire arc, especially in the earlier seasons, is essentially a metaphor for that dynamic translated into a superhero context. He's fast enough to be useful to Vought, presentable enough to be marketable, but never given genuine power within the organization. And the moment his heart condition threatens his usefulness, the corporation moves to replace him without a second thought. Jesse T. Usher, who plays A-Train, has talked about how much that historical context shaped the way he played the character's specific brand of internal conflict, that tension between knowing you're being exploited and still wanting to be in the room because the alternative is worse. Let's shift gears and talk about the production design for a second, because this is something that almost never gets discussed but is absolutely wild. The Vought Tower set, which is essentially the corporate headquarters of the entire show's antagonist structure, was designed with deliberate architectural references to real-world buildings associated with American corporate and media power. We're talking about things like the visual language of Trump Tower in New York, the aesthetic of certain Fox News studio spaces, and the broader vocabulary of glass and steel and gold that American wealth uses to signal dominance. Every detail in that set, from the color palette to the proportions of the lobby to the way natural light is managed, was chosen to evoke a specific feeling in viewers on a subconscious level. The idea was that audiences should feel vaguely uncomfortable in that space even when nothing bad is technically happening on screen. Production designer Arv Graywall and his team were essentially using architecture as psychological manipulation, which is, when you think about it, exactly what Vought itself does throughout the show. The set mirrors the company's methods. That level of thematic coherence in production design is genuinely rare. Now here's something about Erin Moriarty, who plays Annie January, also known as Starlight, that I think completely changes how you appreciate her performance. When Moriarty came into the role, she made a very specific decision about Annie's relationship to her own powers. In a lot of superhero stories, the powers are the exciting part, the thing the character is proud of and wants to show off. Moriarty decided that for Annie, the powers are actually a source of deep ambivalence. They're connected to her mother's ambitions for her, to a childhood where she was trained and shaped and molded rather than simply loved. So whenever you see Starlight using her abilities, particularly in the earlier seasons, watch Moriarty's face in the moments right before and right after. There's this flicker of something complicated, something that isn't quite pride or excitement. It's closer to resignation. She's doing what she was made to do, and she's not sure whether that's a good thing. That's an incredibly subtle choice that never gets stated explicitly in the dialogue, but it's there in almost every scene where the powers appear. Speaking of things hidden in plain sight, let's talk about the Deep, played by Chase Crawford, and the specific way the show handles his storyline as a commentary on something very real and very dark. When we first meet the Deep, he commits an act of sexual harassment against Starlight in his first substantial scene. The show doesn't gloss over this. It doesn't make him a cartoon villain because of it. Instead, it then proceeds to show us in excruciating detail the way that someone with power can commit harm and then essentially coast through the institutional protection that power provides. The Deep is demoted, sent to a smaller market, publicly embarrassed, but never actually held fully accountable in any meaningful way. He retains his celebrity. He retains his powers. He retains access to the same circles of power that enabled his behavior in the first place. The writers have confirmed that this arc was directly inspired by the patterns that emerged from the Me Too movement's exposure of how power structures protect predators through partial accountability, enough consequence to create the appearance of justice, not enough to actually change anything. All right. Now we're going to get into some production facts that are just objectively insane. The show films primarily in Toronto, Canada, which means that the version of America you see in The Boys is actually built from scratch on Canadian soil. The attention to detail required to make Toronto feel like it could be anywhere in the United States is genuinely staggering. We're talking about extensive set dressing, prop work, and location scouting to find the right buildings and streets and spaces. But there's a layer to this that's almost poetically fitting. The Boys is a show about how America presents a carefully constructed image of itself to the world, an image of heroism and freedom and exceptionalism that masks something much uglier underneath. And the version of America in the show is itself a carefully constructed image built in a completely different country. The artificiality of the production location mirrors the artificiality of the world it's depicting. Whether that's intentional or just a happy accident of budget and tax incentives, I genuinely do not know. But it's hard not to find that meaningful. Let's talk about Compound V for a second, because the mythology around it in the show is based on something that might surprise you. The idea of a substance that can confer superhuman abilities, that is addictive, that corporations would kill to control, and that has unpredictable and sometimes devastating effects on people who receive it, draws on a very real historical tradition of pharmaceutical and medical experimentation on vulnerable populations. Kripke and the writers have pointed specifically to the history of unethical medical trials, the use of prisoners, soldiers, and people without full informed consent as test subjects for experimental treatments and drugs. The Nuremberg Code, established after World War II to prevent exactly this kind of abuse, exists because these things actually happened. Compound V is a fictional substance, but the power dynamics around it, the secrecy, the corporate motivation, the exploitation of people who have no real choice, those are pulled directly from documented history. The show is asking you to recognize the real world in its fictional horror, which is what the best satire always does. Now I want to talk about something that almost never comes up in discussions of this show, which is the music supervision. The Boys has an absolutely impeccable soundtrack, and the song choices are never accidental. The show uses a technique where it deliberately selects music that creates ironic contrast with what's happening on screen. You'll hear a warm, nostalgic classic rock track playing over something genuinely horrific, or a cheerful pop song accompanying something morally devastating. This isn't just for shock value. It's designed to replicate the experience of consuming corporate media. Think about it. When you watch a feel-good advertisement for a massive corporation, the music is warm and human and emotional. It's designed to make you associate positive feelings with the brand, regardless of what that corporation might actually be doing. The Boys uses that same trick but inverts your awareness of it. You're hearing the manipulation as it happens and recognizing it, which is the entire point of the show. The music supervision team on this show deserves so much more recognition than they receive. Here's a fact about Jensen Ackles joining the show as Soldier Boy that most people know, but what fewer people know is the specific context of why his casting was so narratively brilliant. Ackles spent 15 years playing Dean Winchester in Supernatural, which was also created by Eric Kripke. So when Ackles shows up in The Boys playing a character who is essentially a corrupted, toxic version of the heroic archetype, a character who represents everything dangerous about old-school American masculine mythology, there's a layer of meta-commentary happening that the audience can feel even if they don't fully articulate it. The man who spent over a decade as television's most beloved monster-fighting hero is now playing the monster. The hero has been revealed as a legacy of violence and ego and entitlement that has been sustained by nostalgia and institutional power rather than actual virtue. Kripke has been pretty coy about how intentional this casting choice was in terms of that meta layer, but it's hard to believe it wasn't at least part of the conversation. Let's switch to something about the show's approach to religion, because this is an area where the writing is actually a lot more sophisticated than it gets credit for. The Boys doesn't simply mock religion. That would be easy and cheap. What it actually does is examine the relationship between genuine faith and institutional power. Many of the show's characters who have sincere religious beliefs, like Annie at the beginning of her arc, are depicted with real empathy. Their faith is shown as authentic and meaningful. What the show skewers is not belief itself, but the way that organized religious institutions and corporate entities co-opt the language and aesthetics of faith to consolidate power and control populations. Vought doesn't hate religion. Vought loves religion because religion is an existing system for generating loyalty and compliance, and Vought is very good at plugging into existing systems. That distinction, between faith as a genuine human experience and religion as a corporate tool, is one of the most intellectually honest things about a show that is otherwise extremely comfortable being over the top. Now here's something about the stunt work and action choreography that I think deserves way more attention. The show has a philosophy about superhero violence that is directly opposed to most of the genre. In Marvel and DC films, Superhero violence is typically presented as spectacular and consequence-free. Cities get destroyed, people get thrown through buildings, and the emotional register is excitement and awe. In The Boys, physical violence is almost always presented as grotesque, chaotic, and deeply human in its horror. When someone gets hurt in this show, it looks and sounds and feels like something terrible has happened to a real person. The action choreography team specifically works to strip away the cinematic glamour that usually surrounds superhero combat. The goal is to make you feel the wrongness of what you're watching rather than the excitement of it. This is why the show's most violent scenes are so hard to look away from even when they're deeply uncomfortable. It's not spectacle. It's something closer to tragedy. Here's a wild behind-the-scenes fact that connects the show to real-world corporate behavior in a way that feels almost too on the nose. During the production of one of the seasons, Amazon, which is of course the streaming platform that produces The Boys, a show that is fundamentally a critique of massive corporate power and the way corporations exploit people, was simultaneously being criticized for its own labor practices and working conditions for warehouse employees. The fact that a show this pointed in its corporate satire is produced by and generates profit for one of the world's most powerful corporations was not lost on Kripke, who has made somewhat joking but also not entirely joking comments about the irony. He's referred to The Boys as being like a band that gets to play the most rebellious punk music possible on the biggest stage in the world, which is either an amazing creative situation or a profound example of exactly the kind of co-optation the show is criticizing. Possibly both simultaneously. Let's talk about the character development pipeline, specifically how the writer's room approaches the evolution of characters across seasons. One of the things that makes The Boys distinctive is that character arcs are not written to be inspirational in the traditional sense. In most television, even dark television, characters generally move toward growth, toward healing, toward some version of being better. The Boys is genuinely committed to the idea that trauma, systemic pressure, and power do not produce better people. They produce people who are broken in different configurations. Characters don't get better in this show. They get different. Sometimes they get worse. Sometimes they make genuine progress only to be dragged back by circumstances. This is psychologically much more realistic than most television's version of character development, and it's also significantly more depressing, which is part of why the show feels so heavy even when it's being darkly funny. Something I want to address that almost never comes up is the show's treatment of its female characters, particularly in how it handles the relationship between femininity and power. Shows like this can fall into the trap of depicting female power as simply masculine power in a female body, women who are strong because they fight and dominate and refuse to be soft. The Boys does something more interesting. Characters like Starlight, Queen Maeve, and even in her warped way Stormfront, wield power in ways that are explicitly connected to their identities as women. The way they're expected to perform femininity for the public, the way their power is always filtered through public perception of their gender, the way they're simultaneously hypervisible and dismissed. The show understands that power looks different when you're a woman in a patriarchal system, not because women are less powerful, but because the system creates entirely different constraints and leverage points. That's a nuanced take that a lot of supposedly progressive shows don't actually achieve. Let's get into some specific scene details that were loaded with meaning most viewers might have missed on first watch. There's a scene in Season 2 where Homelander stands alone on a rooftop and talks to his own reflection in a window. On the surface, it looks like a moment of narcissism, which it is, but it's also something more specific. The writers were drawing on a psychological concept related to object permanence and attachment. Homelander, who was raised in a lab and denied normal human bonding, learned to relate to himself as his primary attachment figure. The reflection isn't just vanity. It's him talking to the only entity that has been consistently present in his life. That's a deeply sad read on what superficially appears to be a menacing and self-absorbed moment, and the show gives you just enough to put it together if you're paying attention, but never explains it for you, which is the right call. Here's something about the show's writer's room that fundamentally shaped what The Boys became as a piece of storytelling. Kripke made a deliberate decision to hire writers from very different backgrounds, not just television writers but people with roots in journalism, political commentary, comedy, and long-form fiction. The goal was to bring in perspectives that weren't shaped by the conventions of how superhero stories are typically told. When your writer's room includes people who think about power and media and corporate influence professionally, rather than just narratively, the critique in the show gets sharper and more specific. You end up with storylines that feel like they were written by people who actually understand the mechanisms of the things they're criticizing, not just people who understand how to create the feeling of critique for entertainment purposes. Alright, let me hit you with some rapid-fire facts that are individually smaller but collectively paint this picture of just how dense and deliberate this show is. The name Vought International was chosen specifically because of its sound. It has that heavy, slightly military feel that evokes American industrial power. The number 7 in the 7 is a deliberate reference to the Justice League, the classic DC team that has 7 core members, and the show's 7 are essentially designed as dark mirror versions of those archetypes. Homelander is Superman gone wrong. The Deep is Aquaman with the societal awkwardness dialed to maximum. Queen Maeve is Wonder Woman filtered through a story of crushed idealism. These parallels are there to make you uncomfortable in a very specific way, because you grew up loving those characters, and the show is asking you to look at what the real-world version of that kind of power might actually produce. The compound that houses Vaught's most classified experiments was deliberately designed to echo the aesthetic of mid-century American government institutions, specifically the visual language of agencies like the CIA in their early years. The architecture of secrecy, the fluorescent lighting, the beige hallways, the bureaucratic mundanity of evil. The show understands that the most frightening things don't look frightening. They look like offices. Let me also talk for a second about the show's international expansion, because the spin-off content, like Gen V and what's been developed for other markets, represent something genuinely interesting about how the franchise is growing. Rather than simply exporting the American version of corporate superhero satire to other countries, the spin-offs are designed to engage with how the specific dynamics of power, celebrity, and institutional corruption manifest in different cultural contexts. Gen V, which is set in a university context, takes the show's themes and applies them to the specific American anxiety around academic institutions, meritocracy mythology, and the ways that young people are shaped and exploited by systems that claim to be developing their potential. It's the same critique applied to a different institution, which is the right way to expand a franchise that's fundamentally about how institutions work. One more deep dive before we get to the end, and this one is about something that operates almost entirely below the level of conscious recognition for most viewers. The sound design of The Boys is doing a tremendous amount of work in every scene. The way the show mixes ambient corporate sound, the hum of fluorescent lights, the ambient noise of the city, the specific acoustic quality of different spaces, is used to create subliminal feelings of unease or comfort or confinement. The Vought Tower interior sounds different from the street-level world of Butcher and The Boys, and those sonic differences are there to reinforce the class and power distinctions the show is dramatizing. When you're inside the system, it sounds a certain way. When you're outside it, it sounds different. Most viewers will never consciously notice this, but they'll feel it, and that feeling shapes how they interpret everything that happens in those spaces. There's something I want to close on that I think is the most important fact about The Boys that almost nobody talks about, which is that the show is ultimately about the relationship between audiences and the stories they consume. Every time you watch a superhero movie and feel the dopamine hit of the hero winning, of justice being served, of the good guys triumphing, you're participating in a kind of mass cultural experience that The Boys is trying to make you think critically about. Not because there's anything wrong with enjoying those stories, but because those stories shape our expectations of what power should look like and how justice should work. And when those expectations meet the real world, they can leave us confused and unprepared for how messy and ambiguous and institutional actual power is. The show is asking its audience to be smarter consumers of the stories they're told. Not to stop enjoying stories, but to understand that stories always have an agenda, whether that's the explicit propaganda of Vaught's superhero media machine or the subtler agenda of the actual entertainment industry producing the content you watch for relaxation. That's a genuinely challenging and uncomfortable thing to sit with, which is exactly why The Boys keeps you coming back. The fact that a show this intellectually pointed has become one of the most watched programs in streaming history is either a sign that audiences are hungry for this kind of challenge, or it's the most elaborate example of the show's own themes playing out in real time. A piece of revolutionary content being consumed at massive scale, generating profit for a corporation, becoming another piece of the entertainment machine it claims to critique. Maybe both things are true. Maybe that tension is the whole point. Kripke might be the most honest person in the room, making art about the room he's standing in while fully acknowledging that he's standing in it. The Boys isn't just a show about superheroes being terrible. It's a funhouse mirror held up to every system of power we've decided to trust. And if you weren't already watching it with that frame in mind, I hope this video changed that for you. There's so much more to find in every single episode when you know what to look for. If you dug this breakdown, hit that like button and subscribe because I go this deep on shows, films, and stories all the time, and this is genuinely just the tip of the iceberg. Drop in the comments what detail from the show you think most people sleep on. I read all of them and I want to know what you've caught that I might have missed. I'll see you in the next one. What if I told you that one of the most violent, disturbing, and brutally honest shows on television right now started as something nobody in Hollywood wanted to touch? The Boys has become a cultural phenomenon, a show that makes people uncomfortable in the best possible way, and today we are going deep on facts, secrets, and behind-the-scenes details about this series that most fans have absolutely no idea about. Whether you have watched every single episode 3 times or you just discovered the show last week, I guarantee there is something in this video that is going to completely change the way you look at The Boys. Stick around because we are saving the most shocking revelation for the very end. And trust me, you do not want to miss it. Let us start at the very beginning, and I mean the actual beginning, long before any cameras were rolling or any casting decisions were made. The Boys is based on a comic book series written by Garth Ennis and illustrated by Derek Robertson. The comics were published by Wildstorm initially, starting back in 2006, and what is genuinely fascinating is that even the comic book publisher eventually got cold feet about how far the content was going. DC Comics, which owned Wildstorm at the time, actually cancelled the series after just 6 issues because the material was considered too extreme and too offensive even by comic book standards. Think about that for a second. A comic book series got dropped because it was too wild, and that same story eventually became one of Amazon Prime Video's most watched shows of all time. The series was then picked up by Dynamite Entertainment, which allowed Ennis to continue telling the story exactly the way he intended, with 0 restrictions. That creative freedom carried over in spirit when the show was eventually developed for television. Now here is where things get really interesting from a behind-the-scenes perspective. The television adaptation of The Boys was not always going to be on Amazon. The project bounced around Hollywood for years, and multiple networks and streaming platforms passed on it. The show was initially developed at Cinemax, which is where it actually got its first real traction. Seth Rogen and Evan Goldberg were brought on as executive producers, and they worked alongside showrunner Eric Kripke to shape what the series would eventually become. Eric Kripke, by the way, is the same creator behind Supernatural, which ran for an absolutely massive 15 seasons on the CW. When Cinemax passed on moving forward with the project, Amazon stepped in and picked it up, and the rest, as they say, is history. What is remarkable about this is that Amazon was not known at that point for edgy, violent, mature content in quite the same way. Taking on The Boys was genuinely a bold move for the platform. Eric Kripke has spoken in various interviews about his approach to adapting the source material, and one of the most interesting things he has discussed is how deliberately he and his writing team chose to diverge from the comics. The comics are extraordinarily graphic, and while the show is certainly not shy about violence or adult content, Kripke made a conscious choice to give the characters more emotional depth and more genuine humanity than they have in their printed counterparts. Billy Butcher in the comics, for example, is significantly darker and more morally compromised than the version we see Carl Urban bringing to life on screen. Television Butcher still has a code, still has some kind of internal moral compass even if it is bent and damaged. Comic Butcher operates in a much colder, more ruthless base. This was an intentional creative decision because Kripke understood that for a television audience investing potentially years of their lives into a story, they needed characters they could actually care about, even when those characters were doing terrible things. Speaking of Karl Urban, let us talk about the casting process for a moment because it is genuinely fascinating. Karl Urban is a New Zealand actor who had built an impressive career in major Hollywood franchises before The Boys. He was Dr. McCoy in the rebooted Star Trek films, he was Judge Dredd in the underrated 2012 film Dredd, and he had roles in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. But Billy Butcher represented something different for him. Urban has described Butcher as one of the most complex and demanding roles of his career, and when you watch his performance, you understand why. The character requires Urban to walk a razor-thin line between being genuinely threatening and genuinely sympathetic, sometimes within the same scene. The accent alone, a specific London working-class sound, required extensive preparation. What many fans do not realize is that Urban himself was deeply involved in shaping how Butcher would be presented, working closely with Kripke and the writers to find the character's humanity. Anthony Starr, the actor who plays Homelander, might be giving one of the greatest villain performances in the history of television, and that is not an exaggeration. Starr is from New Zealand as well, and before The Boys, he was perhaps best known for his work on the series Banshee, where he played a very different kind of morally complex character. The way Starr approaches Homelander is genuinely fascinating from an acting perspective. He has talked about playing Homelander as someone who is fundamentally broken, a person who was raised without love in a clinical, experimental environment and who never developed the emotional tools that normal human beings take for granted. Homelander's terrifying nature comes not from some innate evil but from a profound emotional emptiness. Starr plays him simultaneously as a petulant child and as the most dangerous being on the planet, and the combination creates something that is deeply unsettling to watch. The smile Homelander uses, that particular frozen, slightly too wide expression, was something Starr developed deliberately as a mask the character wears. Here is a fact that surprises a lot of people. The set design and visual effects team on The Boys operate on a scale that rivals major Hollywood films. The Seven's headquarters, the corporate aesthetic of Vought International, the various superhero costumes, all of these require enormous resources and creative effort. The costume department in particular has spoken about the challenge of designing superhero outfits that look genuinely impressive and cinematically striking while also serving the show's satirical purpose. The Deep's costume, for example, which includes those elaborate fish gills on his neck, required extensive prosthetics work for each shooting day. Chase Crawford, the actor who plays the Deep, has mentioned in interviews that the prosthetics application process could take a significant amount of time each morning before shooting even began. This is the invisible labor behind television that audiences rarely think about, but it fundamentally shapes the world audiences experience. Let us shift to talking about the satirical layer of the show, because this is something that separates The Boys from virtually every other superhero property in existence right now. The series functions as a direct critique of corporate power, media manipulation, celebrity culture, and the way heroism gets packaged and sold as a product. Vought International is not just a fictional corporation that manages superheroes. It is a mirror held up to real-world entertainment conglomerates, pharmaceutical companies, and political propaganda machines simultaneously. The show has never been subtle about this intention, and Eric Kripke has confirmed in various public statements that the satire is absolutely deliberate and pointed. What is striking is how the show has managed to be politically critical in ways that resonate with viewers across different parts of the political spectrum. Different people watch The Boys and see different real-world targets in Vaught's behavior, and that ambiguity is actually a sophisticated piece of writing rather than an accident. The character of Starlight, played by Erin Moriarty, went through significant development between the source material and the television series. In the comics, Annie January is present, but her arc and her relationship with the other characters unfolds quite differently. The television version of Starlight is more fully realized, given more agency, and serves as the moral center of the story in a way that grounds the show's more extreme elements. Moriarty has spoken about the physical and emotional demands of playing a character who is essentially trapped between two worlds, someone who genuinely wants to be good in an environment that punishes and exploits genuine goodness. The show uses Starlight's experience to comment on what happens to idealism when it collides with institutional corruption, which is one of the most quietly devastating threads running through the entire series. Now let us get into some production details that even dedicated fans tend to not know about. The Boys films primarily in Toronto, Canada, which stands in for a fictionalized version of New York City. Canadian tax incentives make Toronto an attractive production location for many American streaming and network productions, but the crew has to work creatively to make a Canadian city read convincingly as the American metropolis. Set decorators, location scouts, and digital effects artists all collaborate to transform Toronto streets, buildings, and public spaces into the show's version of New York. Some locations are used largely as they are with minimal modification, while others require substantial transformation. This is an enormous logistical challenge that unfolds across every single episode. The gore and special effects work on The Boys has become somewhat legendary in television production circles. The show is famous for pushing boundaries in terms of what it depicts visually, and achieving those effects requires a combination of practical effects work and digital enhancement. The practical effects team builds props, creates prosthetics, and uses various physical techniques to produce visceral moments that then get refined or augmented in post-production. There is a creative philosophy behind this approach, which is that practical effects, things that physically exist on set, tend to look more convincing and more genuinely shocking than purely digital creations. The two approaches work together to produce moments that genuinely make audiences gasp, which is very much the intended effect. One of the most interesting creative decisions the show made early on was regarding how superpowers would be portrayed. Rather than leaning into the fantastical, consequence-free spectacle of traditional superhero films, The Boys treat superpowers as physical phenomena with real-world physics and real-world consequences. When someone with superhuman strength punches through something, the results look genuinely brutal. When Homelander uses his laser vision, the destruction is presented with a gravity that most superhero properties avoid. This grounded approach to depicting powers serves the show's larger argument about what superheroes would actually be like if they existed, which is to say terrifying rather than reassuring. Let us talk about the music choices in The Boys, because the show's soundtrack is doing a tremendous amount of work that deserves more attention than it typically gets. The series has a habit of using popular, upbeat, cheerful songs in stark contrast to the violent or disturbing imagery on screen. This technique, sometimes called counterpoint scoring, has a long history in cinema, but The Boys uses it with particular effectiveness and wit. The jarring collision between a familiar song you might associate with positive memories and something genuinely horrifying creates a specific kind of discomfort that reinforces the show's satire. It suggests that violence and darkness can hide behind cheerful surfaces, which is precisely the point the show is making about Vought and about superhero mythology more broadly. Here is something that many people do not know about the show's development. When Amazon ordered The Boys to series, there were internal discussions about how extreme the content could actually be. The Boys operates at a level of graphic content that was unusual for a streaming platform even by the standards of prestige television. The fact that Amazon allowed the show to fully commit to its vision, rather than softening the edges to make it more broadly palatable, was about the way institutions protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. The superheroes of The Boys are not just metaphors for celebrities or for political figures, though they serve that purpose. They are representations of any system or institution that presents itself as serving the public good while actually prioritizing its own power and reputation. The Boys, the vigilante team at the center of the story, represent the impulse to resist and hold power accountable, even when that resistance is imperfect, morally complicated, and sometimes self-defeating. The relationship between Billy Butcher and the other members of his team has been one of the most consistently compelling elements of the show. Mother's Milk, played by Laz Alonso, provides a counterbalance to Butcher's more extreme impulses and serves as the group's conscience in practical terms. Frenchie, played by Toma Capone, and Kamiko, played by Karen Fukuhara, form one of the show's most emotionally resonant partnerships, a relationship built on mutual understanding between two people who have both been shaped by violence and trauma. The casting of these characters was meticulous, and the chemistry between the actors is something that cannot be manufactured through writing alone. The ensemble as a whole functions as a kind of found family, which is a deliberate storytelling choice that gives the audience an emotional anchor amid all the chaos and darkness. Karen Fukuhara's portrayal of Kimiko is particularly noteworthy because the character does not speak for a significant portion of the series, communicating instead through physical performance, expression, and body language. This places enormous demands on Fukuhara as a performer, requiring her to convey complex emotional states without the tool that most actors rely on most heavily. Fukuhara has spoken about working with a choreographer and movement coach to develop Kimiko's specific physical vocabulary, the way she moves, holds herself, and expresses emotion through her body. The result is a character who feels completely coherent and emotionally legible despite the absence of dialogue, which is a remarkable acting achievement. Now, something that genuinely surprises many fans when they learn it. The Boys has been deliberately engineered to generate conversation and controversy, not accidentally but as a strategic creative and marketing philosophy. Eric Kripke and his team understand that a show this satirically pointed and this willing to be provocative will naturally generate debate, and they have spoken about embracing that dynamic rather than trying to manage or minimize it. When episodes drop and social media erupts with reactions, arguments, and discussions, that engagement serves the show's visibility on the platform and in the cultural conversation. The controversy is part of the product in a very intentional way, which is itself a kind of meta-commentary on how media properties manufacture attention in the modern landscape. Let us talk for a moment about Soldier Boy, played by Jensen Ackles, who was introduced in later seasons. The casting of Jensen Ackles was enormously significant for reasons beyond just his talent as an actor. Ackles spent 15 seasons playing Dean Winchester on Supernatural, the show that Eric Kripke created before The Boys. Bringing Ackles into The Boys was a reunion of sorts, and it was also a piece of very deliberate casting in terms of audience psychology. Ackles built a massive, devoted fan base through Supernatural, and those fans brought enormous enthusiasm to his appearance in The Boys. Within the narrative of the show, Soldier Boy represents a different era of manufactured heroism, a character who embodies mid-20th century American mythology in ways that are both nostalgic and deeply uncomfortable. Ackles committed to the role with the same total investment he brought to his years on Supernatural. The show's depiction of media manipulation and the 24-hour news cycle deserve specific attention because it is one of the more prescient elements of the series. The fictional Vought News network, which serves as the show's stand-in for partisan cable news operations, captures something true and troubling about how information gets weaponized in the modern media environment. The scenes involving VNN are often written in ways that are uncomfortably close to actual media rhetoric and techniques, which is part of what makes them land with such force. Writers' rooms for shows like The Boys employ people who study media, politics, and culture with genuine academic seriousness, and the show's portrayal of media manipulation reflects that research. Here is a detail about the show that connects to its production philosophy in an interesting way. The Boys does not use laugh tracks, obviously, but it also deliberately avoids the visual language of traditional superhero films. The cinematography is darker, more naturalistic, and less polished than what you would see in a Marvel or DC film. This is a deliberate aesthetic choice designed to signal to the audience that they are in different territory. When superhero films use bright, saturated colors and sweeping orchestral scores, they are communicating something about the nature of heroism, that it is grand and clean and elevated. The Boys uses grittier visual textures and a more grounded aesthetic to communicate the opposite, that power is messy and dark and compromised. One of the most fascinating aspects of The Boys from a production standpoint is how it handles the tension between spectacle and satire. The show needs to deliver genuine action and excitement to satisfy audiences who expect something visually compelling from a superhero property, while simultaneously undercutting the mythology of superheroism that makes those expectations exist in the first place. This is a genuinely difficult balance to strike, and the fact that the show manages it as successfully as it does speaks to the quality of the creative team. Action sequences in The Boys are staged to be exciting and visually impressive, but they almost always contain an element that deflates or complicates the heroic framing, some detail that reminds you these are not the good guys you are supposed to be cheering for. The Boys has spawned a spin-off series called Gen V, which focuses on college-age superheroes attending Godolphin University, a school for young people with powers. This expansion of the Boys universe represents a significant investment from Amazon in this creative world, and it demonstrates confidence in the franchise's longevity. Gen V operates with a slightly different tone and targets some of the same satirical targets as the parent series, but with fresh perspectives and new characters. The existence of Gen V also raises interesting questions about how the Boys universe might continue to expand, whether through additional spin-offs, films, or other formats. Something worth discussing is the global resonance the show has found. The Boys has attracted enormous international audiences, not just in the United States, and there are interesting reasons for why the show's themes translate so effectively across different cultural contexts. Corporate power, media manipulation, and the exploitation of vulnerable people by powerful institutions are not uniquely American problems. These are universal experiences, and The Boys speaks to them in ways that resonate regardless of where you happen to be watching from. The show has topped streaming charts in multiple countries, which reflects this universality. The writing room for The Boys has always included writers from diverse backgrounds, and Eric Kripke has spoken about the intentionality behind building a writer's room that brings multiple perspectives to the table. This diversity of experience and viewpoint is reflected in the show's ability to critique power from multiple angles simultaneously. A less diverse creative team might produce a show that critiques power from a single ideological direction, but The Boys manages to raise questions and challenges that resonate with people who hold very different political and social viewpoints. That is a genuinely sophisticated piece of collective writing. Let us talk about fan response for a moment, because the audience for The Boys is one of the most engaged and analytically sophisticated fan communities on the internet. Theory crafting, close reading of episodes for hidden details and foreshadowing, intense discussion of character motivations and thematic implications. All of these activities happen on platforms like Reddit, YouTube, and Twitter at extraordinary scale. The show rewards this kind of engagement because it is layered with intentional details that only become visible on repeat viewings or on close analysis. Easter eggs, references to the comics, symbolic visual choices, thematic callbacks across episodes and seasons, all of these elements give engaged fans something to dig into and discuss, which drives ongoing conversation and keeps the show present in the cultural conversation between seasons. The relationship between The Boys and the superhero genre more broadly is worth thinking about carefully. Marvel and DC, the dominant superhero brands, have spent decades building audiences that deeply love and are emotionally invested in superhero mythology. The Boys is both parasitic on that mythology and critical of it simultaneously. It can only work as a satire if the audience has enough familiarity with and affection for superhero conventions to feel the impact when those conventions are violated or inverted. In a world without the Marvel Cinematic Universe, The Boys would land differently and possibly less effectively. The show's power is inseparable from the cultural context it emerged from. Now for something that might actually change how you watch the show going forward. The visual design of Vought International as a corporation draws from a very specific real-world reference pool. The aesthetics of Vaught's branding, marketing materials, and corporate culture are modeled on actual major entertainment corporations, pharmaceutical companies, and consumer brands. Production designers have talked about researching corporate branding strategies, internal corporate culture materials, and marketing psychology to ensure that Vought feels authentically, recognizably corporate in ways that go beyond surface-level imitation. The sterile, cheerful, relentlessly positive aesthetic of Vought is based on real research into how major corporations present themselves publicly while concealing quite different internal realities. This attention to detail is part of why the satire lands so effectively. Homelander's relationship with dairy products and specifically with milk is one of the show's most discussed symbolic choices. It is not accidental. The imagery connects to ideas about nourishment, about what Homelander was denied in his childhood, about the way he seeks comfort and validation from external sources because he never received genuine love. The show uses these recurring visual motifs deliberately as a form of visual storytelling that operates parallel to the dialogue and explicit narrative. When you notice these patterns and understand their implications, the show becomes substantially richer as an experience. There is something worth saying about the show's ending, or at least where it has been going, in terms of what Eric Kripke has said publicly about his vision for the series. Kripke has indicated that he always had a specific conclusion in mind for the boys, a sense of what the show is ultimately building toward. This is not the kind of series that is being indefinitely extended without a plan. There is a destination, and the decisions made in each season reflect awareness of where the story needs to arrive. Showrunners who have a clear vision of their ending tend to make better decisions throughout the run of a series because every choice is oriented towards something specific rather than simply prolonging what already exists. The cultural impact of The Boys extends beyond the show itself into broader conversations about the superhero genre, about corporate power, and about American mythology. Critics and academics have written about the show in ways that treat it as a genuinely significant cultural document, not just as entertainment. There are arguments to be made that The Boys is the most important superhero text of this current era precisely because it refuses to accept the terms of superhero mythology and insists instead on interrogating them. In a media landscape saturated with superhero content, a show that questions the very foundations of that genre and finds something troubling beneath the surface is doing genuinely valuable cultural work. One last thing that deserves attention before we wrap this up. The Boys has maintained creative consistency across multiple seasons in a way that is actually quite rare for a long-running television series. Many shows lose their edge, soften their critique, or drift away from their original vision as they become more successful and therefore have more to lose. The Boys has largely avoided this trap, continuing to push harder and go further as the series has progressed rather than retreating to safer ground. This is a reflection of the creative team's commitment to the show's original purpose and also of Amazon's continued willingness to support that vision. Not every streaming platform would allow a show this provocative to operate with this much creative freedom for this many seasons. So there you have it. The Boys is a show built on creative defiance, from a comic too extreme for its original publisher, to a television pitch that bounced around Hollywood for years before finding a home, to a series that has consistently refused to make itself more comfortable or more palatable to avoid controversy. The facts and details behind this show reveal a creative enterprise that is far more intentional, far more sophisticated, and far more carefully constructed than it might appear on the surface. Every choice, from the casting to the production design to the satirical targets to the use of music, serves a coherent vision about power, corruption, and the stories we tell about heroes. If you want to go even deeper on the world of The Boys, there is another video right here that covers the season breakdowns and what every major plot decision actually means for where the story is going. Drop a comment below telling me which fact in this video hit different for you, and subscribe if you are not already part of this community because we go deep on the shows and films that actually matter. See you in the next one. You think you know The Boys. You've watched every season, you've picked your favorite characters, maybe you've even gone down the rabbit hole of fan theories online. But I promise you, there are things about this show that most people have absolutely no idea about. And by the time this video is done, you're going to look at The Boys in a completely different way. We are talking behind-the-scenes secrets, wild casting decisions that almost changed everything, the real-world inspirations that are darker than anything on screen, and details hidden so deep in the show that even obsessive fans have missed them. This is the stuff the creators didn't put in the press interviews. This is the stuff that makes this show one of the most deliberately crafted pieces of television ever made. So if you think you're already a fan, buckle up, because we're about to go somewhere most Boys fans have never been. Let's start with something that will fundamentally change how you watch the very first episode. The Boys was not supposed to be on Amazon. The show was originally developed elsewhere, and it bounced around for years before landing at Amazon Prime Video. Now think about what that means. The show that became one of the most transgressive, boundary-pushing series in television history almost didn't get made the way we know it. Different network, different rules, different version of The Boys. The fact that it ended up on a streaming platform with fewer content restrictions is a massive part of why the show could go as far as it did. Every moment that made your jaw drop, every scene you thought they couldn't possibly include, All of that exists because of a development journey that nearly went in a completely different direction. Now here's something about the comic book source material that casual fans don't fully appreciate. The original comic by Garth Ennis is genuinely more extreme than the show. And that's saying something. The television adaptation actually pulled back significantly on certain storylines and character arcs from the comics. Showrunner Eric Kripke and his team made deliberate choices about what to keep, what to change, and what to leave out entirely. Some of the decisions were creative, some were practical, and some were about making sure the show could actually function as ongoing television rather than a contained story with a definitive brutal endpoint. The interesting thing is that many of the changes made the show better. Characters who were one-dimensional in the comics became layered, compelling people on screen. The show's version of Homelander, for instance, became something far more psychologically complex than what appeared on the page. Speaking of Homelander, let's talk about Anthony Starr because what he does in that role is something that the casual viewer might take for granted. Starr is from New Zealand. He's playing an American character who is essentially a warped version of the American dream itself. And he does it with a precision and control that most actors simply don't have. But here's what you might not know. The physical and psychological preparation Starr put into that role went well beyond normal acting preparation. He studied the behavior of cult leaders. He researched narcissistic personality disorder extensively. He looked at charismatic figures throughout history who used charm as a weapon. The smile that Homelander uses, that unsettling smile that makes your skin crawl even when the character seems perfectly pleasant, that was a deliberate construction. Starr built that smile to represent the gap between what Homelander projects and what he actually is. Every time you see it, you're watching a performance built on months of psychological research. But here's the layer that most people miss. Starr has spoken about playing Homelander as someone who is fundamentally a child. Not a child in terms of intelligence, but a child in terms of emotional development. Someone who was raised in a lab, who was never taught how to be human, who desperately wants love but has no idea how to receive it or give it. That interpretation transforms every scene he's in. When Homelander is terrifying, it's because he's a child having a tantrum. When he's pitiful, it's because he's a child who has never shown affection. That reading of the character is built into every scene he plays, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Now let's talk about Carl Urban, who plays Billy Butcher. Urban is from New Zealand as well, and his Cockney accent in the show is something he worked on specifically for this role. But what you might not know is the character's accent and general demeanor was actually drawn from specific real-world inspirations that go deeper than just the sound of the voice. Butcher is written as someone whose entire personality is a performance of toughness designed to mask devastating grief. The Cockney swagger, the constant aggression, the refusal to show vulnerability, it's all armor. Urban understood this and built the performance from the inside out. The accent and the attitude are things Butcher puts on every morning like a uniform. That's why the moments when the armor cracks hit so hard. You're not just watching a tough guy falter. You're watching someone's entire constructed identity start to fail. Here's something fascinating about the casting process for the show. When Amazon was putting together the ensemble, there was enormous pressure to cast the biggest possible names in the lead roles. Kripke and the producing team resisted this in specific ways because they understood something crucial about the show's psychology. The Boys works because the soup characters feel genuinely superhuman and the human characters feel genuinely human. If you fill the cast with already established movie stars, you risk the audience bringing their existing associations with those actors into the show. Some of the best casting decisions were counterintuitive precisely because they chose performers who were relatively unknown to mainstream audiences at the time. This allowed viewers to meet these characters fresh, without preconceptions. Erin Moriarty, who plays Annie January, also known as Starlight, is a perfect example of this. Moriarty's arc across the series is one of the most demanding acting journeys in the entire show. She has to play someone who starts as genuinely idealistic, gets systematically disillusioned, and then has to rediscover what she actually believes versus what she was conditioned to believe. The emotional range required is extraordinary. And Moriarty does it while also playing opposite one of the most magnetic performers on television in Anthony Starr, which requires holding your own against an enormous gravitational pull. The fact that she was not yet a massive star when she took the role actually served the character. Annie feels like someone you might know, someone real. That groundedness was a casting choice. Let's pivot to something that doesn't get discussed enough, which is the writing room and how the show's satirical targets are chosen. The Boys has a reputation for going after corporate greed, celebrity culture, and media manipulation. But the show's writers have been remarkably open about the fact that they deliberately avoid making their satire too specifically tied to any single real-world moment. The reason is longevity. If you write an episode that is too specifically about one particular news story or one particular public figure, that episode starts to feel dated within months. The writers aim for the underlying systemic issues rather than the surface manifestations. This is why the show still feels sharp and relevant across multiple seasons. It's not satirizing the specific, it's satirizing the structural. The specific examples change. The underlying rot they're pointing at does not. This is also why the show resonates with viewers across a pretty wide political spectrum, which might seem surprising given how aggressive its critiques are. Because the show isn't really attacking any particular political tribe. It's attacking the machinery of power itself, the way institutions corrupt individuals, the way celebrity becomes a tool of control, the way heroism gets manufactured and sold. These are concerns that land differently depending on your political starting point, but they land for almost everyone. Now here's something about the production design that changes how you see every frame. The world of The Boys is divided into a very specific visual language. The world of Vought and the Soups is saturated, bright, almost aggressively colorful. Everything is polished and warm and inviting. Meanwhile, the world of Billy Butcher and the Boys is desaturated, grittier, lit with cooler tones. This is not accidental. The production design team built an entire visual philosophy around the idea that the world of corporate superheroes is essentially a permanent advertisement, and the world of the people fighting them is closer to reality. When characters cross between these visual worlds, you feel it even if you don't consciously register it. Your eye is constantly being told something about where power lives and what it looks like versus where ordinary people exist. The Tower of Vought itself deserves a whole discussion. The architectural choices for that building were deeply deliberate. It's designed to evoke luxury, corporate power, and a kind of religious authority all at once. Think about the way the interior spaces are used for gatherings that function almost like worship services. The show is making a continuous argument about the relationship between corporate branding and religious devotion, and the set design embeds that argument into the physical space of the story before a single word of dialogue is spoken. Let's talk about one of the most technically demanding aspects of the show, which is the visual effects work. The Boys is not a massive tentpole film with a $500 million budget. It's a television show that has to deliver convincing superhero effects episode after episode. The way the VFX team handles this is genuinely innovative. Rather than trying to compete with Marvel or DC films on the level of spectacle, the effects work on The Boys is deliberately integrated into the tonal register of the show. The violence is visceral rather than balletic. The powers feel dangerous rather than elegant. The whale sequence, the plane sequence, certain moments in Season 3, these are not designed to be awesome in the traditional superhero sense. They're designed to be disturbing. The VFX team was given a specific brief that their work should feel wrong, not cool. That's an unusual creative direction to give a visual effects team, and the results speak for themselves. Here's something about the show's music that most people don't think about. The song choices in The Boys are not just needle drops. They are arguments. Every time the show puts a specific piece of music over a specific scene, it's making a deliberate point about the contrast between what a song means culturally and what's actually happening on screen. The use of cheerful, patriotic, or innocently nostalgic music over scenes of corporate manipulation or violence is a technique the show uses constantly. And it works because it exploits the gap between what we've been conditioned to feel when we hear certain sounds and what we are actually watching. It's essentially the same technique the show uses with superhero iconography. Take something that's supposed to make you feel safe and good. Use it to make you feel deeply uncomfortable. That's the show's whole thesis in musical form. Now let's go somewhere really interesting. The show has a complicated relationship with its own popularity. Eric Kripke has talked about this in interviews, the strange experience of making a show about the dangers of corporate manufactured heroes and watching it become a massive corporate product. The Boys merchandise exists. The Boys theme park experience has been discussed. The Boys is itself a product of Amazon, one of the largest corporations on the planet. The show is aware of this tension. There are moments of self-awareness built into later seasons that seem to directly address the irony of what the show has become. Whether that self-awareness fully resolves the tension is a question fans and critics continue to debate, but the fact that the writers are thinking about it is itself significant. Let's talk about Toma Capone, who plays Frenchie, because his background brings something extraordinary to the show. Capone is Israeli, and he came to the role with a performance approach deeply influenced by his theatrical training. Frenchie is written as a character who uses humor and flamboyance as protective mechanisms, someone who makes himself entertaining so that people will keep him around. There's a sadness underneath all of Frenchie's color that Capone communicates through physical stillness in moments when the character thinks no one is watching. It's subtle acting work in a show that often operates at maximum volume, and it creates a fascinating counterpoint. When Frenchie is quiet, you feel the weight of everything he carries. Karen Fukuhara, who plays Kimiko, had a unique challenge in the show's early seasons. Her character is non-verbal for significant stretches of the story. She communicates almost entirely through physical performance and facial expression. This is an extraordinarily demanding form of acting, and Fukuhara has spoken about studying physical performance techniques specifically to handle the role. What's fascinating is that Kimiko became one of the most beloved characters in the show despite, or arguably because of, the limitation of her early characterization. The audience projected onto her in ways they couldn't with the more vocally expressive characters. There's something psychologically interesting about how silence creates intimacy. Fukuhara's physical storytelling built a connection with viewers that some of the more dialogue-heavy characters never quite achieved. Here's a fact about the show's production schedule that puts everything in context. The Boys films in Toronto, and the production team has to essentially construct an alternative version of a major American city within a Canadian city. The locations team has to constantly find or build spaces that read as specifically American to international audiences, while navigating the practical realities of what Toronto actually looks like. This involves extensive set decoration, strategic angle choices, and sometimes complete set builds. The Vought Tower exterior work required significant technical creativity to create the impression of a Manhattan-scale corporate headquarters. This kind of logistical challenge is invisible to the viewer but shapes every decision about how scenes are shot and staged. Now let's get into something that goes deeper than most fan discussions. The show's treatment of trauma is more sophisticated than it gets credit for. Nearly every major character in The Boys is operating from a place of unprocessed trauma. Butcher is grieving and cannot stop. Starlight is dealing with systemic abuse she was taught to minimize. Kimiko carries violence inflicted on her from childhood. Huey starts the show experiencing acute traumatic loss. The Deep has experienced various forms of coercion and is in profound denial about all of it. Maeve has essentially dissociated from her own life. Even Homelander, the primary antagonist, is written as someone whose evil is rooted in the violence done to him as a child by the very corporation that then deployed him as a weapon. The show doesn't use trauma as backstory decoration. It uses it as the engine of behavior. Every choice these characters make, including the destructive ones, makes sense when you trace it back to what was done to them. This is sophisticated psychological writing, and it means that even when characters do terrible things, the show maintains emotional coherence. You understand why even when you can't excuse it. Here's something about Claudia Dumont, who plays Victoria Newman, the character revealed to be a soup hiding in plain sight within the political establishment. Dumont is Australian. Her American politician performance is constructed with specific awareness of political body language and rhetoric. She and the writers built a character who represents something very specific. The idea that the most dangerous kind of power is the kind that presents itself as accountable and ordinary. Newman is terrifying not because she seems like a monster, but because she seems like a reasonable person. The audience's trust in her is deliberately cultivated so that the betrayal hits harder. Every scene where she seems sympathetic is a trap. Let's talk about Jim Beaver, who has a recurring role in the show. Beaver is best known to many audiences from his work with Eric Kripke on Supernatural. His presence in The Boys is part of a broader pattern of trust that Kripke brings to his productions. He works repeatedly with actors he's collaborated with before because he understands that part of what makes a show work is the comfort and shorthand that develops between creators and performers over time. The ensemble feel of The Boys isn't accidental. It was cultivated through deliberate choices about who was invited into the creative community around the show. Here's a technical detail about the violence in the show that most people don't think about. The gore in The Boys is specifically calibrated. The show's makeup and practical effects teams work in tandem with the VFX team to create violence that feels consequential rather than spectacular. There's a philosophy at work here. Superhero violence in mainstream media is typically presented as consequence-free. People get thrown through buildings and walk away. The Boys is fundamentally an argument against that convention. The violence in the show is designed to remind you that bodies are fragile and that power used without restraint destroys things that cannot be repaired. Every piece of practical gore is a political statement about the glamorization of violence in superhero media. Now here is something that will make you think differently about Season 1 specifically. The pilot episode of The Boys was written with the awareness that most of the audience would arrive with strong preconceptions about superhero stories. The creative team knew they needed to violate those preconceptions in the first episode with enough force to reset the audience's expectations entirely. The death that occurs in the pilot, which is one of the most shocking moments of the entire series, was specifically calibrated to happen before the audience had enough attachment to feel grief, but with enough force to feel the wrongness of it. The mechanics of that scene were discussed extensively in the writer's room. The question was, how do you make an audience understand that nothing in this world is safe without making them too emotionally distant to keep watching? The answer was precision. Hit hard enough to disrupt, but not so hard that you break the connection. Let's talk about Amazon's role in the show because it's more complicated than it appears. Amazon is the distributor and a major financier of The Boys, and the show regularly satirizes corporations that use entertainment and heroism as marketing tools. Amazon is itself a massive corporation with significant controversies around labor practices and market power. The show has made jokes and references about this tension within its own narrative. Kripke has been publicly thoughtful about the relationship, acknowledging the irony while arguing that making the show from inside the machine is part of what gives it access to the audience it needs to actually matter. Whether you find that convincing or not is a legitimate question. But the fact that the show exists in this specific tension is something that shapes every creative decision about how far the satire is allowed to go. Something that rarely gets discussed is the role of intimacy coordinators on the show. The Boys contain significant sexual content, and the production has been open about using intimacy coordinators to manage those scenes in ways that protect performers and ensure that the content serves the story rather than existing gratuitously. This is a relatively recent development in the industry, and one that represents a significant shift in how productions handle vulnerable content. The presence of this kind of professional infrastructure on set affects the quality and authenticity of what ends up on screen. Performers who feel safe are able to do their best work. Here's something about the show's international reception that's worth knowing. The Boys has a genuinely global audience, and it resonates differently in different cultural contexts. In countries with strong traditions of political satire, the show is often read as conventional in its targets, the powerful and corrupt, even when the methods are unconventional. In countries where superhero mythology has a strong cultural hold, the show is often read as more radical. In some markets, the show's critique of American corporate power and American patriotism lands as specifically anti-American in ways the creators probably didn't entirely intend. The show means different things to different audiences, and that semantic flexibility is actually part of its strength. It's a target-rich environment for interpretation. Let's get into something about the show's future and what the production team has indicated about how they plan to end things. Kripke has been clear that The Boys has a specific ending in mind. This is rarer than you'd think in television, where shows often continue beyond their natural endpoint because the economics of a successful series push toward extension. The willingness to plan and commit to an ending reflects a creative confidence that not every showrunner has, and it suggests that the final season, whenever it arrives, will be built to satisfy rather than to leave doors open for more product. Given that the show's entire philosophy is about the damage done when powerful things refuse to end, there would be a certain poetic justice in the show itself being willing to stop. Now let's talk about Gen V, the spin-off series, because it reveals something interesting about how the Boys universe is being expanded. Gen V is set at Godolphin University, a college for young soups, and it operates with a slightly different tonal register than the parent show. It's younger, more focused on identity and institutional corruption at the formative level, the damage done to people before they fully become who they're going to be. The existence of Gen V as a spin-off raises interesting questions about world building. Every expansion of a universe that works through specificity runs the risk of diluting what made the original specific. The creative challenge for Gen V was to find its own reasons for existing rather than simply being more boys. Whether it succeeded is something fans continue to debate, but the attempt itself shows an awareness of the risks of expansion. Something interesting about the casting of younger characters across both shows is the deliberate casting of performers who carry a specific kind of contemporary energy. There's an awareness in the casting choices that The Boys is a show that has to feel current, not nostalgic. The soups are a metaphor for things that are happening right now, and the people embodying those metaphors need to feel like people who exist in the present moment. Here's a detail about Homelander's costume that rewards close attention. The suit is red, white, and blue in the obvious way, but the specific design choices embed additional layers of meaning. The eagle iconography on the suit is positioned and styled in ways that evoke military insignia as much as superhero iconography. The suit is supposed to read as flag, uniform, and costume simultaneously. It's designed to trigger multiple simultaneous associations: patriotism, military authority, and performative spectacle. Every time Homelander is on screen in the suit, he's a walking argument about how those three things have become intertwined in American culture, and how the intertwining serves power rather than people. Here's something that gets at the heart of what makes The Boys work as more than just transgressive entertainment. The show takes seriously the question of what it would actually mean to have people with that kind of power in the world. Not in a wish fulfillment way, but in a what would really happen way. And the answer the show keeps returning to is that the problem is not the powers. The problem is the systems that would form around the powers. Vought is not villainous because it employed super-powered people. It's villainous because it did to superpowered people exactly what powerful institutions do to anyone they can control. It manufactured them, monetized them, and deployed them as tools of profit. The soups are not the problem. They are the product. And the real horror of the show is that the structure creating them is recognizable because it's the structure we already live in, just wearing a cape. This is the show's central psychological hook and the reason it stays with you long after you finish an episode. The Boys is not really about superheroes. It's about power and what power does to people and to the systems that accumulate it. The soups are a thought experiment. What if the people who run things could do whatever they wanted with absolute impunity? The show's answer is not a fantasy answer. It's a realistic answer. And it's uncomfortable specifically because you recognize it. The show also takes seriously the psychology of people who oppose power. Butcher and the Boys are not heroes in any conventional sense. They do terrible things. They are motivated by grief, anger, and revenge as much as by any genuine moral principle. The show refuses to give the audience a clean protagonist to root for because clean protagonists would undermine the argument. If the good guys were genuinely good, then the message would be that individual virtue can overcome systemic corruption. The Boys doesn't believe that. It believes that the system corrupts everyone it touches, including the people fighting it. And that's a much darker and more honest argument. Here's something about the show's longevity and cultural staying power. The boys arrived at a specific cultural moment when superhero fatigue was starting to set in among parts of the audience that had grown up with the Marvel and DC dominance of popular culture. It offered something that the mainstream superhero product couldn't: consequences, complexity, and a refusal to make you feel good about power. It essentially created a new lane in a crowded genre by being the anti-product within the product category. And the audience that was hungry for exactly that found it and made the show a phenomenon. Every fact we've covered today, from Anthony Starr's psychological research to the deliberate visual grammar of the production design to the specific calibration of the pilot's first act violence, points toward the same thing. The Boys is one of the most deliberately constructed shows on television. Nothing in it is accidental. Everything is an argument. Everything is a choice. The gap between what it looks like and what it actually is, which is the gap between glossy superhero entertainment and deeply uncomfortable social critique, is itself the whole point. And here's the final thing, the payoff for staying through all of this. The reason these facts matter is not trivia. It's not about knowing more than other fans. It's about watching the show with your eyes fully open to what it's doing. Because when you understand the intent behind the construction, every scene gets richer. Every performance gains additional dimension. Every visual choice starts to speak. The Boys is a show that rewards the kind of attention most people never give television because most television doesn't deserve that attention. This one does. So watch it again. Watch it knowing what you know now. Watch Star's smile and think about the child who was never shown love. Watch Butcher's armor and wait for the moments it cracks. Watch the saturated, warm light of Vought Tower and recognize it for what the show is telling you it is. Watch the music choices and hear the argument underneath the melody. You're not just watching a show about superheroes doing terrible things. You're watching one of the most sophisticated critiques of power and mythology that popular television has ever produced. And now you know how to see it. You think you know The Boys. You've watched every season. You've followed the drama. You've picked your sides between Butcher and Homelander, and you genuinely believe you've got this show figured out. But here's the thing, there is a mountain of behind-the-scenes chaos, wild creative decisions, bizarre casting stories, and hidden details buried inside this show that most fans have never heard about. And some of this stuff is so strange, so unexpected, that it's going to completely change the way you watch The Boys the next time you sit down with it. So stay with me, because we are going deep today. Let's start with something that might genuinely shock you. The Boys almost didn't exist in the form you know it. The comic series by Garth Ennis and Derek Robertson, which the show is based on, was originally published by DC Comics under their Wildstorm imprint. Now here's where it gets interesting. DC actually cancelled the comic after just 6 issues. They pulled the plug on it because the content was considered too extreme, too offensive, and too politically charged even for a mature imprint. Ennis and Robertson had to take the book elsewhere, and it eventually found a home at Dynamite Entertainment, where it ran for its full 72-issue run. If DC had simply continued publishing it, the trajectory of how this story reached mainstream audiences might have looked completely different. The cancellation arguably gave the book more underground credibility and cult status, which eventually made Amazon take notice. Speaking of Amazon, the journey from comic to screen was not smooth or quick. The show went through years of development purgatory before it actually got made. Seth Rogen and Evan Goldberg, who serve as executive producers, were involved in bringing the project to life, but it bounced around different networks and studios before Amazon Studios finally committed to it. There were genuine moments where it looked like the show was never going to happen at all. The subject matter was considered too risky, too controversial, and too difficult to market to a mainstream audience. People inside the industry thought you simply couldn't build a prestige television show around the brutal deconstruction of superheroes and corporate corruption. Amazon proved everyone wrong. Now let's talk about casting, because there are some absolutely wild stories here. Carl Urban, who plays Billy Butcher, was not the first choice for the role. Multiple actors were considered before Urban landed the part, and when you find out that Urban essentially lobbied hard for the job, it makes his performance hit differently. Urban is a massive comic book fan and actually knew the source material well before auditioning. He understood what Butcher was supposed to represent in ways that went beyond what's on the surface. That deep understanding of the character is part of why his portrayal feels so layered and complex. Urban reportedly pushed hard to get meetings with the showrunners and convinced them he was the right fit through sheer persistence and passion for the material. Then there's Anthony Starr, who plays Homelander, and this man deserves his own entire documentary. Starr is from New Zealand, and before landing this role he was perhaps best known internationally for the series Banshee. But the way he approached Homelander is genuinely one of the most fascinating acting choices in modern television. Starr has talked about how isolating it was to play the character, because Homelander is so thoroughly repellent and disturbing that he had to maintain a certain psychological distance from other cast members to preserve the on-set dynamic. The character works partly because of real tension between Starr and the rest of the cast, and Starr has leaned into that deliberately. There are stories from the set where other actors would feel genuinely uncomfortable around Starr when he was deep in character mode, which tells you everything about how committed he is to the role. What makes Homelander so terrifying as a character, and this is something the writers have discussed openly, is that he was specifically designed to be a commentary on a certain type of unchecked narcissism that exists in powerful institutions. The Superman aesthetic was chosen deliberately because Superman is the most universally recognized symbol of heroic virtue and goodness. Corrupting that image completely was the entire point. Every time Homelander does something monstrous while wearing that suit, the visual dissonance is the statement. The showrunners wanted audiences to feel that contrast as sharply as possible. Now here is a fact that a lot of people have missed entirely. The show films primarily in Toronto, Canada, not in the United States. The city of Toronto has been dressed up and disguised to look like a fictional American city so effectively that most viewers never notice. The production design team does an extraordinary job of hiding Canadian street signage, architecture details, and environmental elements that would give the location away. There's an entire department dedicated specifically to making Toronto not look like Toronto. When you go back and watch with this in mind, you'll start spotting small details you never noticed before. The budget for The Boys is substantial, but perhaps not in the ways you'd expect. A significant portion of the budget goes not into the superhero action sequences, but into the elaborate practical effects and makeup work. The show famously uses a combination of practical effects, prosthetics, and digital effects, and the showrunners have consistently prioritized practical work wherever possible. This was a deliberate creative philosophy from the beginning. Producer Eric Kripke, who created Supernatural and serves as showrunner on The Boys, wanted the violence and the grotesque elements to feel as real and physical as possible rather than clean and digital. That commitment to practical messiness is a huge part of why the show has a visceral quality that sets it apart from other superhero content. Let's talk about some of the specific scenes and the nightmares behind making them. The infamous submarine scene in Season 2, which involves a character being violently killed in an extremely graphic and bizarre way, became one of the most discussed and debated moments in the show's entire run. What most people don't know is that the scene was the subject of significant internal debate about whether to include it, how graphic to make it, and what purpose it was actually serving narratively. The writers' room apparently had extended conversations about the line between purposeful shock and gratuitous content. The decision to keep it in and to make it as extreme as they did came down to the show's core philosophy that superhero stories have been sanitized to an extreme degree and that confronting audiences with truly ugly consequences was part of the point. Erin Moriarty, who plays Annie January, also known as Starlight, has spoken extensively about how physically and emotionally demanding the role is. What's interesting is how Starlight was developed differently in the television show compared to the comic. In the source material, Starlight's story is considerably darker and more one-dimensionally tragic. The show's writers made a conscious choice to build her into a more active and complex character with genuine agency, which required significant creative departures from the comic. Moriarty brought a lot of her own instincts about the character's emotional journey to the role, and the writers were receptive to collaborating with her on how Annie evolves across seasons. Toma Capone, who plays Frenchie, is actually Israeli, and his performance involves him speaking English with an accent that is somewhat ambiguous in its European flavor, which was an intentional creative choice. Frenchie's background is deliberately kept somewhat mysterious in the show, and that extends to his accent and linguistic patterns. Capone worked with dialect coaches extensively to craft exactly the right sound for the character. The chemistry between Frenchie and Kimiko, played by Karen Fukuhara, was something that developed very naturally during production, and the writers noticed it immediately. The relationship between those two characters became increasingly central to the show's emotional heart, partly because of how genuine the connection between the two actors was on set. Karen Fukuhara herself has an extraordinary story connected to this show. Her character Kimiko is almost entirely nonverbal, communicating primarily through physicality, expression, and sign language. Fukuhara worked with ASL consultants and movement coaches to develop Kimiko's specific physical vocabulary. The challenge of conveying an entire inner life, complex emotions, humor, grief, and rage without dialogue is enormous, and the fact that Kimiko is one of the most beloved characters on the show is a testament to how brilliantly Fukuhara handles it. There were conversations early in production about whether giving the character dialogue would make her more accessible, and the decision to keep her largely silent was ultimately maintained because it actually made her more powerful and distinctive. Here's something genuinely interesting about the show's political dimension. Eric Kripke has been very open about the fact that The Boys is explicitly political satire, and the show has been praised and criticized from multiple points across the political spectrum, which the creators take as a sign that they're doing something right. The interesting paradox of the show is that it has been enthusiastically embraced by audiences with completely opposite political worldviews, each seeing their own targets being skewered in the content. This was not entirely accidental. The writers' room deliberately constructed the satire so that no single political tribe could claim the show as their own. Vought International, the corporation at the center of the story, represents a kind of institutional corruption that transcends simple left or right categorization, which is what allows the show to function as genuine satire rather than partisan cheerleading. The Deep, played by Chase Crawford, was a character that could have easily been a simple comic relief villain, but the show took him somewhere considerably more interesting and uncomfortable. Crawford has talked about the challenge of playing a character who is simultaneously pathetic, dangerous, creepy, and occasionally sympathetic. The writers gave The Deep a storyline involving a cult-like self-help organization that was directly inspired by research into real-world cult dynamics and predatory wellness organizations. The satire there is pointed and specific, and Crawford committed to making the character genuinely sad rather than simply ridiculous. Now let's get into some of the more obscure details that even hardcore fans tend to miss. The show contains an enormous number of background Easter eggs, visual references, and hidden details that reward extremely attentive viewing. The fake superhero news broadcasts that appear in the show's world, the in-universe advertisements for Vought products, the fictional superhero merchandise visible in background shots, all of this is meticulously designed and contains jokes and references that are never explicitly pointed out. The production design team has essentially built an entire alternate history of superhero culture into the visual fabric of the show, and exploring that background world is its own hobby for the most dedicated fans. The character of A-Train, played by Jesse T. Usher, carries a storyline about performance-enhancing drug use among supes that was written as a direct parallel to real athletic doping scandals and the institutional pressure that drives athletes toward self-destruction. What's less known is that the writers also layered into A-Train's arc a commentary on the commercialization of black culture and athleticism specifically, which adds an additional dimension to his character's journey that some viewers pick up on and others miss entirely. Usher has discussed in interviews how important it was to him that A-Train not be reduced to a one-note character, and how he worked to find the human vulnerability inside someone who has compromised themselves completely. Let's talk about Garth Ennis, the original creator of the comic, and his relationship with the show. Ennis has been fairly candid about his complicated feelings regarding the adaptation. He was not heavily involved in the television production, which is common for comic creators when their work gets adapted. Ennis has expressed that some of the changes made for the show were things he wouldn't have done himself, while also acknowledging that adaptation requires transformation and that the show has its own valid identity separate from the comic. The most significant philosophical difference between the comic and the show is arguably in how the story treats its characters' capacity for redemption and growth, which the show explores with considerably more generosity than Ennis's original vision. The music choices in The Boys are another element that doesn't get enough attention. The show has made extraordinarily bold and often very funny decisions about which songs to use in which moments, and the music supervision team has developed a specific philosophy about how music can undercut or amplify the horror of what you're watching simultaneously. One of the most striking aspects of the show's musical identity is the use of upbeat, cheerful, or nostalgic songs during scenes of extreme violence or moral corruption. This creates a dissonance that is the audio equivalent of what the visual design does with superhero aesthetics. The specific song selections have often generated enormous online discussion and debate, which the music team clearly enjoys. Here's a fact about the production that reveals something about how seriously the show takes its world building. The fictional superhero team at the center of the story, the Seven, has detailed fictional backstories, in-universe biographical histories, and mythologies that exist in the show's world but that are never fully explained on screen. The writers have developed these backstories in depth internally, which then informs how individual characters reference their histories, even when those references are oblique or brief. This kind of deep world-building investment is what gives the show a sense of genuine weight and history that you can feel even when you can't fully articulate why. Dominique McElligott, who plays Queen Maeve, has one of the most interesting character arcs in the show's history, and her background is worth knowing. McElligott is Irish, and like Starr, brings a non-American background to a character who is essentially a warped version of an iconic American superhero figure. Maeve's arc across the series, which involves her transition from complicit cynicism back towards something resembling moral courage, was something McElligott felt strongly about and advocated for within the production. The writers have described her as deeply engaged with Maeve's journey and insistent that the character's redemptive elements be handled with real care. There's also an interesting story about how the show handles the legal and clearance issues around superhero imagery. Because the show is explicitly about parodying and deconstructing the superhero genre, and because many of its characters are clearly designed as corrupted versions of trademarked heroes, the legal team working on the show had to navigate an extremely complex landscape of intellectual property law. The characters are always positioned just enough away from their obvious inspirations that they avoid direct infringement, while maintaining the cultural resonance of what they're referencing. This legal tightrope has actually become part of the show's creative texture, because the distance between the reference and the parody is itself part of the commentary. Now, Supernatural fans will know that Eric Kripke has a specific set of creative instincts around ensemble storytelling, mythology building, and the dynamic between characters who are technically working together but who have fundamentally incompatible visions of what they're doing. All of those instincts are visible in The Boys, but operating at a higher budget and a higher level of satirical sophistication. Kripke has talked about how his years running Supernatural taught him specific lessons about sustaining long-running ensemble narratives, and how to avoid the trap of running out of story while the audience is still invested. Those lessons are visible in how The Boys structures its seasonal arcs. Let's shift to something that involves the actual mechanics of filming. The show's fight choreography deserves more recognition than it typically gets. The action sequences in The Boys are notably different from those in mainstream superhero films, in that they emphasize the horror and consequence of superpowered violence rather than its spectacle and cool factor. When Homelander does something violent, the camera work and editing choices are designed to make you feel sick rather than exhilarated. This required very deliberate choreographic and directorial decisions to prevent sequences from accidentally becoming the kind of awesome action set pieces they were explicitly designed to critique. Jack Quaid, who plays Huey Campbell, has spoken about how Huey functions as the audience surrogate in a very specific and intentional way. Huey is the character who enters this world from outside it, who begins with recognizable moral instincts, and who the audience is supposed to track as those instincts get complicated and compromised by everything he encounters. Quaid has noted that there's a significant departure from the comic book version of Huey in terms of the character's overall demeanor and how he processes trauma, and that these changes were made to make him more relatable to a contemporary audience. The television Huey is softer and more emotionally articulate than his comic counterpart, which creates a different kind of tension around how the violence and moral compromise of his world changes him. The relationship between Butcher and Huey is worth examining in this context because it's one of the show's most carefully engineered emotional dynamics. From a screenwriting perspective, they function as a kind of dark mentor and reluctant student pairing where the mentor is not actually a positive influence and the student's challenge is to recognize that and chart their own course. Urban and Quaid have discussed how they work to find the genuine affection underneath Butcher's manipulative exterior, because without that affection, the relationship wouldn't work emotionally. Audiences need to believe there's something real between them, even while the show is clearly demonstrating that Butcher is using and corrupting Huey. Here's a lesser-known production detail. The show employs a significant number of consultants from various specialized fields who review scripts and production details for accuracy and resonance. This includes people with backgrounds in corporate communications, military operations, government intelligence, and public relations, all of whom contribute to making Vought International feel like a plausible and terrifyingly real kind of institution. The PR machinery around the Seven, the way Vought manages scandals and controls narratives, is written with a specificity that comes from actual understanding of how those systems work in real organizations. That research investment shows in the texture of the show. Something that has come up in multiple interviews with the creative team is the deliberate choice to make Vought International function as a critique of entertainment corporations specifically as much as a more than a generic corporate villain. The way Vought uses superhero mythology to sell products, manage public perception, and create emotional dependency in consumers is a portrait of how certain real entertainment conglomerates operate that is sharper and more pointed than it might initially appear. The show is in some sense a piece of entertainment criticizing the entertainment industry's own manipulation of audiences, which gives it a self-aware quality that adds depth to the satire. The spin-off series Gen V, which centers on a college for superpowered young people run by Vought, expanded the world of the boys significantly and introduced a new generation of characters. What's interesting from a production standpoint is that Gen V was developed as a genuine creative expansion rather than simply a cash grab extension of the main series. The creative team on Gen V was given real latitude to explore different tonal registers and thematic territory, resulting in a show that feels connected to the boys but distinctive in its own right. The relationship between the two shows in terms of how events in one affect the other was planned with considerable care to ensure continuity without either show being dependent on the other for comprehension. Let's talk about the show's approach to religion, because it's another element that tends to generate a lot of conversation. The Boys takes a complex and often darkly satirical view of how religion intersects with celebrity and power, and this is handled with more nuance than a simple anti-religious stance. The show is critical of how religious imagery and rhetoric get weaponized by powerful figures rather than being broadly dismissive of faith itself. This distinction is important and deliberate. The writers have been careful to show characters with genuine faith dimensions without reducing those characters to simple targets of mockery. The visual effects team on The Boys works under constraints that would be familiar to anyone who knows how television production works, which is to say they have to achieve cinematic quality results on a television timeline and at a television cost per episode, even accounting for the show's substantial budget. The way the show has worked around visual effects limitations is to use them strategically, concentrating resources on specific key moments rather than spreading VFX evenly across every episode. This produces a variable texture to the show's visual presentation that is actually artistically interesting, alternating between intimate, grounded scenes and moments of extravagant visual spectacle. One of the most genuinely fascinating aspects of the show's production is how the writer's room operates. Eric Kripke has described the writer's room as deliberately combative and generative, a space where ideas are attacked and defended vigorously and where the discomfort of that process is viewed as essential to producing sharp, surprising material. The show's willingness to go places that feel genuinely unpredictable and uncomfortable comes from a writing culture that specifically rewards proposals that make everyone in the room feel a little nervous. That institutional culture is a significant part of why the show maintains its edge. Billy Butcher's backstory, and specifically the details of what happened to his wife Becca, is handled quite differently in the television show than in the comic, and this change is one of the most consequential creative decisions the showrunners made. The television version of Becca's fate, and the introduction of Ryan as a character creates a very different emotional architecture for Butch's obsession and moral position. Urban has spoken about how important it was to him that Butch's hatred of soups not be purely ideological but have a specific, personal, irreducibly human cost beneath it. The television version of Becca's story gives Urban's performance a different quality of grief that he draws on throughout the series. The show has also become notable for how it handles its female characters, which has been a subject of genuine critical discussion. The creative team has made deliberate efforts to ensure that female characters in the show have full and complex inner lives, rather than simply serving the stories of male characters. Starlight, Queen Maeve, and Kimiko all have independent character arcs with their own thematic weight. The show has not been perfect in this regard by any critical account, but the intention and effort to do better than the source material in this specific dimension is visible and acknowledged. Ryan's character arc across the latter seasons of the show is one of the elements the creative team has put particular emotional investment into, because Ryan represents something that no other character in the show does, which is the question of whether someone born into corruption and power with extraordinary destructive capability can choose a different path. The child actor cast in the role, Cameron Crevetti, has been given material that would challenge adult performers, and the show's handling of Ryan's psychology has been praised for its care and seriousness. Here's something worth knowing about the fan culture around this show. The Boys has generated one of the most analytically engaged fan communities of any contemporary series, with dedicated spaces online devoted to identifying background Easter eggs, tracking continuity details, analyzing character psychology, and debating the show's political meanings. The production team is aware of this community and has on occasion left intentional rewards for extremely close viewers, small details, and callbacks that only make sense if you've been paying close attention across multiple seasons. This creates a kind of meta-level engagement between the show and its most dedicated audience that functions as its own form of storytelling. The show's marketing has always been unconventional and often deliberately provocative, which mirrors the content of the show itself. Amazon has allowed the marketing team considerable latitude to promote The Boys in ways that play into its satirical universe rather than simply advertising it as a conventional television drama. The in-character social media presence of fictional entities from the show's world, the fake Vought advertisements, and the various meta-promotional materials have blurred the line between the show's fictional universe and the real world in ways that extend the experience for engaged viewers. As we come toward the end of what we've been looking at today, it's worth stepping back and thinking about what The Boys represents in the larger context of where superhero storytelling has been and where it's going. The show arrived at a specific cultural moment when superhero content had reached a kind of saturation point and audiences were beginning to show fatigue with the genre's conventions. The Boys didn't just subvert those conventions, it performed a kind of surgical deconstruction of them, examining why those conventions exist, who they serve, and what they cost culturally. That is a different and more ambitious project than simply making a darker superhero story. The influence the show has had on how the industry thinks about superhero content is real and ongoing. Conversations happening right now inside studios and at streaming services about how to approach superhero material have been shaped by the success and cultural penetration of The Boys. The show demonstrated that audiences were hungry for something that took the genre's premises seriously enough to question them, and that appetite has not disappeared. Eric Kripke has been candid that from the beginning, his vision for the show was to use the superhero framework to talk about power, specifically about what happens to human beings when they acquire power without accountability, and about the institutions that form around concentrated power to protect and extend it. Everything in the show, all the grotesque imagery, all the satire, all the character drama, is ultimately in service of that central inquiry. When you watch The Boys with that in mind, it coheres in a way that is genuinely impressive. Every excess, every shocking moment, every dark turn is pointed at the same question. That's what separates The Boys from content that is merely transgressive for attention. The transgression is intentional and purposeful. The discomfort it creates in viewers is designed to generate thought rather than just reaction. And the fact that it manages to do this while also being enormously entertaining, funny, and propulsive as a drama is the real achievement. Next time you sit down to watch it, you're going to see it differently. Because now you know what's underneath. Look, I need to be honest with you right at the start of this video. I have been watching superhero content my entire life. Comics, movies, animated series, all of it. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, prepared me for what The Boys actually is underneath the surface. Because most people watch this show and they see the violence, the chaos, the dark humor, and they think they understand it. They think they've figured it out. But there is an entire universe of facts, real decisions, real history, and real hidden details buried inside this show that even the most dedicated fans have completely missed. And by the end of this video, I promise you are going to look at The Boys in a completely different way. We are going to go deep today. Not surface-level trivia. Not the kind of stuff you find in a 10-second clip on social media. I am talking about the creative decisions that almost destroyed the show before it even started, the character details that were hidden in plain sight for years, the real-world connections that the creators deliberately embedded into every single season, and some things about the cast that will genuinely change how you watch every scene going forward. So if you have ever called yourself a fan of The Boys, stick around, because you are about to find out just how much you have been missing. Let's start with something that almost nobody talks about, and that is the origin story of how The Boys even got made into a television show in the first place. Because this was not a smooth journey. This was not a situation where some studio executive read the comic book and immediately said, yes, let's green light this thing. The Boys comic series, written by Garth Ennis and first published back in 2006, was considered by pretty much everyone in Hollywood to be completely unproducible. And when you read the original comics, you start to understand why. Ennis was writing a story that was deliberately designed to be as transgressive and as uncomfortable as possible. He was pushing against superhero culture at a time when superhero culture was just beginning to absolutely take over popular entertainment. The comic was initially published through DC's Wildstorm imprint, but DC actually cancelled it after just 6 issues because the content was considered too extreme even for them. It then moved to Dynamite Entertainment, where Ennis was able to finish the story the way he originally intended. So by the time this property made its way to Hollywood, it carried with it a reputation for being essentially too dark, too violent, and too politically sharp to survive the adaptation process intact. There were years of development attempts that went nowhere. The property bounced around, people were attached and then detached, and the general consensus was that any version of The Boys that could actually get made for mainstream audiences would have to be so watered down that it would lose everything that made it interesting in the first place. And then Amazon got involved, and specifically Eric Kripke got involved, and everything changed. Now here is something that actually surprises a lot of people when they learn it. Eric Kripke, the showrunner and the person most responsible for what The Boys became on screen, was the creator of Supernatural. That show ran for 15 seasons on the CW and was a very different kind of television. But what Kripke brought to The Boys was this deep understanding of how to balance genuine darkness with character work that makes audiences actually care about the people they are watching. He understood that you cannot just have shock value. You have to have heart underneath it, otherwise the audience eventually disconnects. And that balance, that very deliberate mixture of horror and humanity, is really the secret to why The Boys works as well as it does. But here is where it gets really interesting. Kripke has talked in interviews about the specific creative philosophy he and his team brought to the adaptation. They were not trying to faithfully reproduce every element of the comic book. In fact, some of the most beloved elements of the television show, some of the characters you have come to care about the most, are significantly different from their comic counterparts or were created entirely for the screen. And this was a deliberate choice. Kripke understood that what worked on the page in 2006 needed to be translated for an audience watching in a completely different cultural moment. The targets of the satire needed to evolve. The emotional stories needed to be deepened. And certain characters needed to be fundamentally reimagined to carry the weight the show required. Let's talk about Homelander, because you cannot talk about The Boys without talking about Homelander. Anthony Starr's performance as this character has been called one of the best villain portrayals in the history of television, and that is not hyperbole. But here is something fascinating about how that character was constructed. Starr has spoken about the approach he took to Homelander, and it is deeply rooted in a psychological framework of trauma and abandonment. The choices he makes in every single scene are built on this foundation of a person who was essentially raised without love, without genuine human connection, treated as an asset rather than a child. And Star plays this not as a monster, but as a broken person whose brokenness manifests in truly terrifying ways. What makes this even more interesting is that Anthony Starr is from New Zealand. He is not American. And Homelander is perhaps the most aggressively American character imaginable, wrapped in a flag, the embodiment of a certain kind of nationalist mythology. The fact that this character is being played by someone who grew up outside of American culture actually gives Starr a unique perspective on what he is portraying. He can see the archetype from the outside in a way that perhaps an American actor might not. He has talked about studying the specific kind of performative patriotism and the hollow heroism that Homelander represents, and bringing that studied understanding to every scene. It is a performance built on observation and analysis as much as instinct. And then there is the relationship between Homelander and Stormfront in Season 2, which was one of the most deliberately provocative storytelling choices the show has ever made. The decision to frame that relationship as a kind of toxic romance between two characters who represent very specific and very dangerous ideological positions was not accidental. The writers were drawing direct parallels to the way extremist ideologies can be packaged attractively, how they can be made to seem exciting and even romantic before revealing their true nature. That is a specific, intentional message embedded in the narrative, and the fact that most casual viewers experienced it primarily as a dramatic storyline rather than as explicit political commentary is actually a testament to how skillfully it was executed. Now let's talk about Karl Urban and Billy Butcher, because this is a character with some genuinely surprising real-world dimensions. Urban, who is also from New Zealand by the way, which means both Homelander and Butcher are being played by New Zealanders, has spoken about the physical and emotional demands of playing this character. Butcher is written as this relentlessly driven, almost self-destructive force of nature, and Urban has talked about leaning into the working-class British identity of the character as a way to access the chip on his shoulder, the class resentment, and the sense of being an outsider within every system he operates in. But here is something that many fans do not know. The Butcher of the television show is actually a significantly more sympathetic character than the Butcher of the original comic books. In Ennis's original vision, Butcher is far more ruthless and far more morally compromised. The television version gives him a backstory and an emotional wound, specifically around his wife Becca and what happened to her, that makes him understandable and even pitiable in ways the comic version never really was. This was a very conscious decision by the writers to make sure audiences had someone to root for, or at least someone to feel complicated things about, as they navigated a show where almost everyone is deeply flawed. The Becca storyline itself is actually an invention of the television show that has no direct equivalent in the comics, and it fundamentally changes the emotional architecture of everything Butcher does throughout the series. His motivation is not just abstract revenge against Vought and against the Supes. It is deeply personal, and it is driven by love and loss in a way that grounds all of his extreme behavior in something recognizably human. That was a smart piece of writing because it gives the audience an emotional anchor in a show that could easily become overwhelming in its darkness without one. Let's shift to Erin Moriarty and Annie January, also known as Starlight, because her arc across the seasons contains some fascinating real-world dimensions that do not get talked about enough. Moriarty has spoken extensively about the emotional and physical demands of playing a character who is constantly navigating between her authentic self and the performance that Vought demands of her. That tension between authenticity and corporate image management is one of the core themes of the show, and it maps very directly onto real conversations happening in entertainment, in social media culture, and in celebrity culture more broadly. What is interesting about Starlight is that she was conceived from the beginning as the audience's entry point into the world. She is the character who starts out believing in the system, who has genuine idealism, and who we watch have that idealism systematically dismantled. This is a classic narrative device, the innocent character whose loss of innocence mirrors the audience's own journey into understanding the story's dark worldview. But what elevates it beyond the cliché is that Starlight does not simply become cynical. She keeps fighting, keeps trying to hold on to something real, and that stubborn refusal to give up is what makes her one of the most compelling characters in the show. Now here is something genuinely surprising about the production of The Boys that most people have absolutely no idea about. The show films primarily in Toronto, Canada. Not in America, not in New York or Los Angeles where the fictional story is largely set. Toronto has been used to double for American urban environments for decades in film and television, but the specific challenge with The Boys is that so much of the show's identity is tied to a very specific vision of American power and American mythology. The production design team has to work incredibly hard to strip Toronto of its very recognizable Canadian visual identity and transform it into this heightened, slightly distorted vision of American corporate and superhero culture. There is actually a whole layer of the show that is built on this distortion idea. Vought Tower, the corporate headquarters of the superhero industrial complex in the show, is designed to be recognizable and yet slightly wrong in the way that the show's entire vision of America is recognizable and slightly wrong. The production designers have talked about wanting everything in Vaught's world to feel like it is just a few degrees off from reality, just exaggerated enough to be satirical without being so exaggerated that it loses its sting. Because satire only works when the thing being satirized is close enough to reality that the comparison lands. Speaking of Vought and corporate power, let's talk about one of the most underappreciated aspects of the show, which is how it functions as a critique of media and entertainment specifically, not just of superheroes in general. Vought is not just a company that makes superheroes. It is a media company, an entertainment company, a public relations machine. And the show is absolutely saturated with commentary about how media shapes perception, how stories can be manufactured and weaponized, how the line between heroism and marketing has essentially ceased to exist. This is directly connected to real conversations happening right now about the entertainment industry, about streaming culture, about how platforms like the one that broadcasts The Boys actually operate. There is a very deliberate and very ironic quality to the fact that The Boys, a show that is deeply critical of corporate media and corporate control of narrative, is itself a massive corporate streaming product. Kripke and his team are aware of this irony and have leaned into it in various ways throughout the show's run. It adds a layer of self-awareness that sophisticated viewers find genuinely rewarding. The Seven, the superhero team at the center of the show, were designed to function as a dark mirror of the Justice League. Every member of the Seven has an analog in DC Comics, and those parallels are not subtle. Homelander is Superman corrupted. Queen Maeve is Wonder Woman worn down by compromise. A-Train is the Flash consumed by insecurity and addiction. The Deep is Aquaman played as a figure of comedic humiliation. Black Noir is Batman stripped of the heroic mythology. These are deliberate design choices meant to force the audience to look at the superhero archetypes they love and ask what those archetypes would actually look like if they existed in the real world. And here is the fascinating thing about Black Noir specifically, because that character has one of the most interesting evolutions in the entire show. In the early seasons, Black Noir functions almost entirely as a silent, terrifying presence, an enigma. And the show's writers use that mystery very deliberately to build dread around the character. The eventual revelations about Black Noir's backstory and inner life represent one of the show's most surprising emotional pivots, taking what seemed like a straightforward menacing figure and revealing layers of tragedy underneath. The creative team has talked about this as an example of the show's broader strategy of hiding genuine emotional complexity inside characters who initially appear to be one-dimensional. Let's talk about the music in The Boys, because this is an element that does not get nearly enough attention, and yet it is one of the most carefully considered aspects of the production. The show uses licensed music in a very specific way, choosing songs that create ironic contrast with what is happening on screen. This technique is not new in film and television. Kubrick was doing it, Scorsese was doing it, but The Boys deploys it with a consistency and a precision that has become one of its most recognizable signatures. The decision to pair extreme violence or corporate horror with cheerful, familiar pop songs does something very specific psychologically to the viewer. It creates a kind of cognitive dissonance that is actually a core part of the show's message. The comfort we feel when we hear familiar music is being deliberately disrupted by the visual content, and that disruption mirrors exactly what the show wants us to feel about the larger cultural landscape it is depicting. The things that are packaged as comforting and familiar, including heroism, patriotism, and entertainment itself, contain something deeply disturbing underneath. The music choices are not just aesthetic. They are thematic. Now let me tell you something about Jensen Ackles and his addition to the show in Season 3 as Soldier Boy, because this is where things get genuinely fascinating on multiple levels. Ackles, of course, worked with Kripke for 15 years on Supernatural, playing Dean Winchester. So when he was cast in The Boys, there was already a deep professional and personal relationship between the actor and the showrunner. But here is what is interesting about how Soldier Boy was constructed. Soldier Boy is in some ways an even more pointed satirical creation than Homelander, because he represents a specific nostalgia, a longing for an imagined golden age of heroism that was never actually golden at all. He is a product of World War II-era mythology, the Greatest Generation narrative, the idea that there was a time when heroism was simple and pure and unambiguous. And the show systematically demolishes that idea. The contrast between the legend of Soldier Boy and the actual reality of who he is and what he did forms one of the show's sharpest and most interesting critiques of historical nostalgia. Ackles has talked about the physical preparation required for the role and also about the challenge of playing someone who is genuinely from a different era, who has been essentially frozen in his worldview and then thawed out into a present that he finds bewildering and contemptible. There is real comedy in that fish-out-of-water dimension of the character, but there is also real tragedy, because Soldier Boy is ultimately a person who is forged in a specific historical moment and cannot adapt beyond it. That inflexibility is presented as both dangerous and pathetic, which is a very precise satirical point. Here is something that genuinely blows people's minds when they first hear it. The training and physical preparation that the cast goes through for this show is extraordinary. Not just in the conventional action hero sense of building muscle and learning fight choreography, although that is certainly part of it, but the specific challenge of performing superpowered characters requires an enormous amount of work on how to move and hold your body in ways that suggest power that exists beyond normal human limits. Anthony Starr has talked about working with movement coaches specifically to develop Homelander's physical vocabulary, the way he occupies space, the way he enters rooms, the way his stillness can be more threatening than any action. This physical dimension of the performance extends to the flying sequences, which involve extensive work with wire rigs and green screen that then has to be seamlessly integrated in post-production. The technology involved in making the superhero powers look believable in the show's heightened realistic aesthetic is genuinely cutting edge, because unlike traditional superhero films, The Boys is trying to make powers look plausible in a world that otherwise resembles our own, which is actually a harder technical challenge than making them look spectacular in a world that is already fantastical. Let me now tell you about something in the writing room that has shaped the show in ways most viewers never consciously register. Kripke has assembled a writing team that brings a very specific set of cultural obsessions and political perspectives to the work. The show has writers who come from backgrounds in political comedy, in drama, in horror, and the way these different sensibilities interact in the room is directly visible in the final product. The Boys is genuinely unusual as a television show in that it can operate simultaneously as sharp political satire, as genuinely affecting emotional drama, and as a horror show with sequences that are legitimately disturbing. The writers have talked about the challenge of maintaining tonal consistency when you are working across such a wide range across a single episode. One scene might be darkly comedic, the next emotionally devastating, the next horrifying, and the challenge is making sure those transitions feel organic rather than jarring. The degree to which the show succeeds at this is really a product of those writers understanding the underlying thematic logic that unifies all those different registers. Because when you understand what the show is actually about, all the different tonal registers make sense as part of a coherent vision. Now let's talk about the character development of the Deep, because Chase Crawford's performance in this role is one of the show's most underrated achievements. The Deep starts out as a figure of contempt, a vain and entitled mediocrity who holds power he has not earned and uses that power abusively. And the show does something genuinely risky with this character across its seasons, which is to make his humiliation and his attempts at redemption genuinely pathetic and yet somehow still sympathetic. You do not forgive the Deep. The show does not ask you to. But you begin to understand him, And that understanding is a kind of dark comedy that Crawford plays with remarkable precision. Crawford has talked about drawing on the specifically coastal elite dimension of the character, the kind of person who has always been handed things and then is completely lost when those things are taken away. There is a very specific American archetype there, the person whose identity is entirely constructed from status and who has nothing underneath when the status disappears. The Deep's arc is in some ways the show's most direct comedy, but it is comedy with a point, about entitlement and accountability and the desperate lengths people will go to in order to avoid genuine self-reckoning. One of the most fascinating creative decisions in the history of the show involves a scene from Season 1 that has become probably the single most talked about and written about sequence in the entire series. I am talking about the whale scene. And what is interesting about the creation of that scene is not just the shock value of it, but the specific creative logic behind it. The writers have talked about how certain scenes in the show are designed to function as gauntlets, as moments that test whether the audience is truly committed to what the show is doing. If you can make it through the whale scene, you have signed on for the full experience. You have accepted the show's terms. This is actually a sophisticated storytelling technique borrowed from literary fiction, where certain passages serve as filters, separating readers who are genuinely engaged from those who are just along for the ride. The most memorable and extreme moments in The Boys are not gratuitous in the sense of being purposeless. They are always serving either a thematic function or a character function or both. And the creative team is very clear about that distinction. The violence and the extreme content are tools, and like any tool, they are only as good as the craftsmanship with which they are used. Let's talk about something that is genuinely important to understand about the show's relationship with its audience and with its cultural moment. The Boys arrived at a very specific time in the history of superhero entertainment. The Marvel Cinematic Universe was at the absolute peak of its cultural dominance when The Boys launched in 2019. The cultural conversation about superheroes was overwhelmingly positive and celebratory. And into that conversation, The Boys dropped like a grenade. But here is what is really interesting. The show has never been simply anti-superhero. It is not nihilistic about the genre. What it is doing is more sophisticated than that. It is asking what these stories actually mean, what values they reinforce, who they serve, and what they might be distracting us from. Those are legitimate questions, and the fact that The Boys asks them through entertainment, through extremely watchable, extremely well-made television, is precisely why it has had the cultural impact it has. It reaches people who might tune out a lecture but who will absolutely keep watching to find out what happens next. The show's engagement with real-world political events is something the writers have navigated very carefully and very deliberately. Events in the real world have a habit of catching up with the show's fictional scenarios in ways that are sometimes startling. Kripke has talked about moments where the writer's room was working on storylines that then became eerily resonant with actual news events, and the challenge of deciding whether to lean into that resonance or to recalibrate to avoid seeming exploitative. That navigation requires real sensitivity and real craft, and the degree to which the show has managed it successfully is part of why it has maintained its critical reputation across multiple seasons. Now here is something about the production that I find genuinely remarkable. The stunt work on The Boys is, by any measure, some of the most complex and ambitious stunt work happening anywhere in television. The specific challenge is that you are staging fights between people who are supposed to have superhuman power and people who absolutely do not, and making that power differential feel visceral and real rather than just technical. The stunt coordinators have talked about developing entirely new approaches to fight choreography specifically for the show, ways of staging and shooting combat that communicate the overwhelming physical dominance of soup characters while still keeping the normal human characters dramatically viable. This extends to the work done by Nathan Mitchell, who plays Black Noir, because that character requires an entirely physical performance with no dialogue and no visible facial expression. Everything Mitchell communicates has to come through body language, through movement, through presence. And creating a character who reads clearly and emotionally to audiences entirely through physical performance, especially one who is often in conflict with characters of very different scale and power, requires extraordinary skill both from the performer and from the choreographers and directors working with him. Let me tell you something about the show that I think is the most underappreciated thing about it overall, and that is the quality of its emotional core. For all the conversation about the violence and the satire and the political commentary, The Boys is ultimately a show about people trying to maintain their humanity under conditions that are designed to destroy it. Every major character in the show is engaged in that struggle, whether they know it or not. Billy Butcher is trying to hold on to the love that drives him even as his methods become increasingly monstrous. Starlight is trying to hold on to her values inside a machine designed to commodify them. Even Homelander, in his deeply broken way, is reaching for something like genuine connection and finding only the hollow performance of it. That emotional architecture is what elevates the show above pure provocation. And it is what keeps audiences coming back season after season, even when the content is genuinely difficult. People are not watching for the spectacle alone. They are watching because they care what happens to these characters, and because the show, beneath all its shock and satire, is genuinely asking meaningful questions about what it means to be human in a world that constantly pressures you to be something else. There is one more thing I want to tell you about before we wrap this up, and it is something that speaks to the long-term ambition of what Kripke and his team have been building. From the very beginning, The Boys was conceived not as a show that would run indefinitely, squeezing content out of a franchise until it collapsed under its own weight, but as a story with a specific ending, a specific destination it was always moving toward. This is increasingly rare in the streaming era, where the commercial incentives push toward endless continuation and spin-off proliferation. The decision to treat the show as a finite story with real stakes and real consequences, where things actually end and characters actually face the results of their choices, is what gives the show its narrative integrity. That commitment to ending, to meaning, to the idea that stories should arrive somewhere rather than just continue forever, is reflected in every creative decision the show makes. The willingness to do irreversible things, to change the status quo in ways that cannot be walked back, to let characters be genuinely lost, is directly connected to the show's awareness that it is building toward something. And that awareness, that sense of purpose and direction, is something audiences feel even when they cannot articulate it. It is the difference between a show that holds your attention and a show that earns it. So the next time you sit down to watch The Boys, I want you to carry some of this with you. Think about the New Zealanders playing the most American archetypes imaginable. Think about the music choices and what they are telling you. Think about the specific emotional wounds that drive every character's choices. Think about the satirical precision underneath all the chaos. Because this show is built with more care and more intention than almost anything else on television right now. And now that you know what to look for, you are going to see it everywhere. If this video gave you something new to think about, hit that like button and let me know in the comments which of these facts genuinely surprised you the most. I am particularly curious whether anyone already knew about the New Zealand connection, because that one gets people every single time. Subscribe if you want more deep dives like this one, because we are just getting started. There is so much more to unpack about this show, and I will see you in the next video. Before Carl Urban ever said a single word as Billy Butcher, the showrunner behind Supernatural sat down and made a quiet decision that would change how millions of people think about superheroes forever. The Boys premiered on Amazon Prime Video on July 26, 2019. The first season dropped all 8 episodes at once, which was a deliberate choice. The creators wanted viewers to experience the story as one continuous journey rather than waiting week to week. It was a binge-first design, and it worked. The show immediately captured millions of viewers and sparked conversations that spread across every corner of the internet. But long before anyone watched a single frame of that show, it existed as a comic book. Garth Ennis and Derek Robertson created The Boys as a comic series that ran from 2006 to 2012. The source material was even more extreme than what made it to television. Showrunner Eric Kripke, who you might know from creating Supernatural, took the comic and carefully shaped it into something that could work as a prestige streaming drama without losing its sharp satirical edge. That balancing act was one of the most interesting creative challenges the production team faced. Eric Kripke has spoken openly about how the show functions primarily as political and social satire. The superheroes in the world of The Boys are not noble protectors. They are corporate products managed by a company called Vought International. Everything about them, their image, Their merchandise, their public appearances, is manufactured and controlled. Kripke wanted to use that fictional world as a mirror held up to real celebrity culture, corporate power, and media manipulation. The result was something that felt uncomfortably familiar. Let's talk about the casting process because it was genuinely fascinating. Karl Urban, the actor who plays Billy Butcher, the fierce and relentless leader of the boys, was not the first person considered for the role. The character is described as having a very specific energy, a coiled tension beneath every word, a volcanic anger always threatening to erupt. Urban brought something irreplaceable to that character. His performance is layered with pain and conviction in a way that made audiences deeply invested in a person who is objectively doing morally questionable things. Urban himself prepared for the role by leaning into the character's backstory, particularly the traumatic loss that drives Butcher's obsession with superheroes. That grief is what makes Butcher understandable even when he's not sympathetic. It's one of the more sophisticated character constructions in the first season. Now here's something that might surprise you. Anthony Starr, who plays Homelander, the show's primary antagonist, is actually from New Zealand. His natural accent is nothing like the polished, all-American voice he uses as Homelander. Starr worked extensively with a dialect coach to perfect that voice, because Homelander needed to sound like the idealized version of American heroism, the kind of voice that reads as trustworthy and wholesome even when everything else about the character is deeply wrong. Anthony Starr has described Homelander as one of the most challenging roles he has ever taken on. Not physically, but psychologically. Playing a character who is simultaneously terrifying and deeply pathetic, who craves approval while also being capable of casual cruelty, required a very specific kind of internal work. Starr has mentioned in interviews that he had to find genuine sympathy for Homelander in order to play him truthfully. He had to understand the character's emotional deprivation and loneliness without excusing any of the monstrous behavior. The writing team spent considerable time developing Homelander's psychological profile. They drew on concepts related to narcissistic personality disorder and what happens when a person grows up completely isolated from genuine human connection. Homelander was raised in a laboratory environment. He never experienced normal childhood bonds. That backstory, revealed gradually through the first season, reframes him from a simple villain into something more tragic and disturbing. Jack Quaid, who plays Huey Campbell, the emotional center of the show, is the son of actor Dennis Quaid and singer Meg Ryan. He grew up in a household with significant Hollywood experience around him, but he pursued his own path methodically. The Huey character is the audience's entry point into this world. When the series begins, Huey is an ordinary young man working a simple job and navigating a comfortable, if somewhat stagnant, relationship. His world gets destroyed in the very first episode in an incident involving a superhero that is simultaneously shocking and darkly comedic. The creators made a deliberate choice to anchor the show through Huey's perspective precisely because he starts from a place of genuine innocence. He has no agenda. He has no mission. He is simply someone who has been catastrophically wronged by a system that protects the powerful and discards ordinary people. Watching him evolve across the first season from heartbroken bystander to active participant in something morally complicated is one of the most satisfying character arcs in the entire run. Erin Moriarty plays Annie January, also known as Starlight, and her storyline in Season 1 is perhaps the most emotionally resonant of all the characters on the superhero side of the story. Annie begins the season achieving her lifelong dream of joining the Seven, the show's version of a premier superhero team. Within her first hours as a member, that dream begins to crumble as she discovers the reality behind the institution she idolized. The show uses Annie's story to explore themes around exploitation, the corruption of idealism, and the experience of speaking up about wrongdoing in environments that punish honesty. Moriarty has spoken about how meaningful those themes were to her personally, and how she wanted to honor the authenticity of what the character was experiencing. Her performance throughout Season 1 walks a careful line between vulnerability and strength that accumulates real emotional power by the finale. Let's slow down for a moment. If you're drifting, that's perfectly fine. Let these facts just float through your mind gently. There's no urgency here. Just interesting details about a fascinating show, delivered at a comfortable pace. Take another slow breath. Let your muscles relax a little more. The production design of The Boys is worth discussing because it's a significant part of what makes the show feel grounded and real despite its fantastical premise. The design team made very deliberate choices about how superheroes would dress, move through public spaces, and interact with corporate environments. The Seven's headquarters was designed to feel like a combination of also feeling slightly wrong up close, almost too perfect, like a mannequin come to life. The show filmed primarily in Toronto, Canada, which might be surprising given how thoroughly American the setting feels. Toronto has become a major production hub for American film and television, and the city has many locations that can convincingly stand in for various American urban environments. The production team worked hard to ensure that nothing felt obviously Canadian, carefully controlling background details, signage, and architectural elements that might break the illusion. One of the more technically impressive sequences in the first season involves a speedboat on the Hudson River that intersects with a whale. This scene required an enormous amount of coordination between practical effects and digital effects teams. The sequence is one of the show's most memorably absurd and shocking moments, and creating it involved challenges around how to make the digital elements feel physically real and weighty rather than obviously computer-generated. The effects team has spoken about the complexity of that particular sequence and how proud they were of the final result. The show's approach to violence was a conscious artistic and thematic choice. The violence in The Boys is not stylized or made to look cool. It is almost always visceral, consequential, and uncomfortable to watch. This was deliberate. The creators wanted to reject the tradition of superhero films and television shows where violence happens without lasting physical or emotional consequences. In The Boys, things break and people do not simply recover. That approach reinforces the show's central argument about how we glamorize power and ignore its costs. The music choices throughout Season 1 are also worth appreciating. The show uses familiar popular songs in moments where the contrast between the cheerful music and the disturbing events on screen creates an unsettling effect. This technique has roots in the tradition of films like A Clockwork Orange and Reservoir Dogs, where the juxtaposition of upbeat music with dark content forces the audience to examine their own emotional responses. The Boys uses this tool with precision. Now let's talk about some of the smaller details that dedicated viewers discovered. The fictional brand of Vought International is embedded throughout the world of the show in ways that casual viewers might miss. There are Vought advertisements in the background of scenes. Vought products appear on shelves. The company's influence is visible in every corner of the world these characters inhabit, which reinforces the idea that Vought is not just a powerful company but a totalizing presence in the culture of this fictional America. The show also includes many satirical references to real-world corporate and political behavior. When Vought executives discuss strategy, their conversations echo actual discussions that happen in boardrooms around marketing, crisis management, and the protection of brand value. When politicians in the show debate whether superheroes should be incorporated into the military, the arguments mirror actual debates about corporate power and the relationship between private entities and government functions. These parallels are entirely intentional. Elizabeth Shue plays Madeline Stillwell, a senior Vought executive who manages Homelander among other heroes. Her performance is fascinating because she plays a character who is completely comfortable with moral corruption while maintaining a surface warmth and professionalism. Stillwell is one of the more chilling figures in the first season because she never seems frightened by what she knows about the people she manages. The dynamic between Stillwell and Homelander is one of the first season's most psychologically interesting relationships. Chase Crawford plays the Deep, a member of the Seven whose storyline in Season 1 functions as both satire and a surprisingly earnest exploration of accountability. The Deep believes himself to be a significant and respected figure. The reality is more complicated. Crawford has spoken about how he appreciated the writers giving the character genuine consequences for his actions, while also allowing space for the audience to understand how someone could be simultaneously culpable and limited in their self-awareness. Laz Alonso plays Mother's Milk, a member of The Boys whose grounded pragmatism makes him one of the most watchable characters in the ensemble. The character has a family, a wife and daughter, which immediately raises the emotional stakes around his involvement in the dangerous work the boys are doing. Alonso has discussed how important it was to him that Mother's Milk not be reduced to a one-dimensional tough guy, that the family element be taken seriously and used to illuminate the real costs of the life he is leading. Karen Fukuhara plays Kamiko, a character who is introduced under circumstances that make her appear dangerous and unpredictable. Her arc across the first season is one of quiet revelation. As audiences learn more about where she came from and what was done to her, the character shifts from a threat to someone who is herself a victim of the same system the boys are fighting against. Fukuhara has spoken about how she worked to communicate Kamiko's inner life entirely through physical performance, since the character does not speak, and how liberating and challenging that constraint was. Toma Capone plays Frenchie, a member of the boys whose backstory involves a complicated personal history with crime and moral failure. Frenchie's relationship with Kamiko becomes one of the emotional cores of the show, and the development of that connection across the first season is handled with more delicacy and care than you might expect from a show with this reputation for intensity. Let the details settle around you like something soft and warm. You don't need to hold onto every word. Just let them drift by. The facts are interesting. The stories are real. And there's nothing you need to do right now except breathe slowly and let yourself be still. The showrunners have discussed how the first season was deliberately structured to escalate in a specific way. The opening episodes establish the world and introduce the central characters. The middle episodes deepen the stakes and complicate the moral landscape. The final episodes push every character to a point where they cannot return to where they started. This three-act structure is applied both to the season as a whole and to individual episodes. One of the creative decisions that had the biggest impact on how audiences received the show was the choice to make the boys themselves morally compromised. These are not simply heroic rebels fighting an evil system. They use deception, manipulation, and violence. Billy Butcher makes choices throughout the first season that are difficult to defend. The audience is asked to root for people who are themselves capable of serious wrongdoing, which creates a more honest and uncomfortable viewing experience than most superhero narratives offer. The relationship between Butcher and Huey is one of the most carefully developed dynamics in Season 1. Butcher sees Huey as useful and recruits him for that reason. But as the season progresses, something more complex develops between them. There is a paternalistic affection that Butcher has difficulty acknowledging, and a hero worship in Huey that gradually gives way to a more clear-eyed and troubled understanding of who Butcher actually is. By the end of the season, the relationship has been tested in ways that neither character could have anticipated. The finale of Season 1, the 8th episode, delivers several significant revelations and shifts the emotional landscape of nearly every major storyline. Without dwelling on specific plot details in a way that might feel too stimulating for sleep, it's worth noting that the writers made sure every character ends the season in a fundamentally different place than where they began. This is good storytelling discipline. Every journey should cost something and change the traveler. Let's take a slower moment. Think about how warm and comfortable you are right now. The details of the show can just wash over you gently. There's no test, no reason to stay sharp. Just interesting things to think about as your mind gets quieter and quieter. The ratings and reception that The Boys received after its premiere were exceptional for an original streaming series. Critics praised its willingness to be genuinely provocative rather than provocative in a safe and calculated way. Audiences responded to the feeling that the show trusted them to handle complicated ideas and morally ambiguous characters without being given easy answers. The show earned multiple award nominations from various industry bodies following its first season. Anthony Starr received particular attention for his work as Homelander, with many critics noting that the character could easily have become cartoonish but instead became genuinely unsettling because of the specificity and humanity Starr brought to the performance. There was a significant amount of thought put into how Vaught's superheroes would be presented as celebrities. The creative team studied real celebrity media coverage extensively to understand how publicity machines work, how carefully constructed images are built and maintained, and how scandals are managed or suppressed. The result is a fictional celebrity culture that feels immediately recognizable because it is based so closely on real patterns of behavior. The show's satirical targets in Season 1 include media consolidation, pharmaceutical companies, the military-industrial complex, organized religion, and the entertainment industry. Each of these targets is embedded in the world of the show not through monologues or editorial moments but through the texture of how the world operates. Characters live inside these systems. The critique emerges from the story itself rather than being stated explicitly. One detail that many viewers found interesting is the way the show portrays the relationship between superheroes and religion. Annie comes from a religious background and has connected her faith to her identity as a hero. The show treats this with more nuance than you might expect, exploring how institutions can co-opt genuine belief for purposes that have nothing to do with the spiritual values at the heart of that belief. The production budget for the first season of The Boys was substantial, reflecting Amazon's commitment to competing with other premium streaming services by investing in genuinely cinematic productions. The money is visible on screen in the quality of the effects work, the production design, and the ability to shoot in multiple locations with large casts and complex sequences. The sound design of the show deserves recognition as well. The way certain scenes are constructed orally, with precise control of ambient sound and music, creates an atmosphere that reinforces the emotional content of what is happening visually. The sound team worked to ensure that the show's quieter moments felt as carefully crafted as its most explosive sequences. Let the quiet of right now be something pleasant. Your breathing is probably slower than it was when we started. Your thoughts are probably less sharp. This is exactly where you want to be. There's still a little more to hear, so let it come gently. The Boys developed a passionate fan community very quickly after its premiere. Viewers created detailed analyses of the show's political subtext, character psychology, and narrative structure. Fan communities across multiple platforms generated discussion, fan art, theories, and creative work inspired by the show. This level of engagement is something the creators have spoken about with genuine appreciation, noting that the show sparked exactly the kind of conversation they hoped it would. Eric Kripke has been active in communicating with the audience about the show's intentions and themes. He has consistently framed the series as a work of satire that invites audiences to examine their own relationship with power, celebrity, and the stories we tell about what makes someone heroic. That clarity of artistic intention is part of what gives the show its coherence and impact. One of the more interesting technical aspects of the first season is how the directors handled the visual presentation of superpowers. The decision was made to ground the superhero action as much as possible in practical reality, rather than leaning into the spectacular visual glamour of big-budget superhero films. Powers are shown with a focus on physical cause and effect, on weight and mass and consequence, rather than as sources of cinematic wonder. This approach is another expression of the show's central thesis about demystifying power. The writing room for the first season was diverse in terms of perspective and background, which contributed to the range of angles from which the show examines its themes. Multiple writers brought different life experiences and areas of expertise to the development of storylines and characters, which is visible in the texture and specificity of the world the show creates. The show manages something genuinely difficult, which is being simultaneously funny and disturbing. Many scenes operate on both registers at once, which requires extraordinary precision in the writing, directing, and performance. The comedy never undermines the emotional reality of what is happening. The darkness never completely overwhelms the show's sense of absurdity. Maintaining that balance across 8 episodes of a first season is a real achievement. You might be feeling very comfortable right now. Maybe your eyes feel heavy, or your thoughts are starting to move more slowly. That's a perfectly natural place to be. There is no hurry. The show's details will still be here in the morning if you want to think about them again. For now, let them just be soft background texture as your mind moves toward rest. The boys of the title, the core group that Billy Butcher assembles, each brings something different to the team's dynamic. Butcher provides drive and ruthlessness. Huey provides moral perspective and emotional grounding. Mother's Milk provides discipline and structure. Frenchie provides expertise and an unexpected warmth. Kimiko provides capability and a kind of silent moral clarity. Together, they function as a counter-institution to Vought, fighting corporate power with improvisation and desperation. The 7, Vought's premier team, mirror and contrast the boys in interesting ways. Where the boys are held together by complicated personal loyalty, the 7 are held together by contract and performance. Where the boys are honest about what they are even when that honesty is uncomfortable, the 7 maintain a constant fiction about what they represent. This structural contrast is one of the show's most elegant organizational choices. The show ends its first season having established a world that is richly detailed, thematically coherent, and populated by characters whose futures remain genuinely uncertain. The choices made in those 8 episodes set up everything that would follow while also functioning as a complete story with its own beginning, middle, and resolution. For a show that arrived with the expectation of being provocative and extreme, The Boys Season 1 surprised many viewers with how emotionally engaged it made them. The satirical framework never prevented genuine feeling from emerging. The dark comedy never kept the dramatic stakes from feeling real. The political commentary never reduced the characters to mouthpieces. All of these elements coexisted because the creative team never lost sight of the human stories at the center of everything. Everything you've heard tonight is just a small selection from the full depth of interesting details available about this show. There are stories about specific production challenges, about lines that almost didn't make it into the final cut, about performances that surprised even the directors, about moments where the shoot went unexpectedly and something better emerged from the improvisation. Stories have layers, and this particular story has many. But that's all for now. Your breathing is slower. The words are coming more softly now. The day has been whatever it was, and now it's over, and you are warm and still in this moment, with nothing particular you need to do or think about. The interesting facts about the boys will keep. They'll be right there if you want to revisit them tomorrow. What matters right now is that you are comfortable, that your mind is gently occupied but not stimulated, that the world outside has gotten very quiet, and that the only thing you're asked to do in this moment is allow yourself to let go. The boys will be there. Season 1 will be exactly as it was. Butcher and Huey and Annie and all of the others will be right where you left them. None of it is going anywhere. And neither are you. You're right here, steady and still, and sleep is very close now, just at the edges of your awareness, warm and patient, waiting for you to stop holding on and simply fall into it. Drift down. Let go. Close whatever is left that's open. You've done well today. You've made it to this quiet place. And now there is nothing left to do except rest. Good night.